doing is going beyond the book and looking at, medieval Korea, medieval Japan, medieval China, medieval India, really, and medieval Africa, going to different places and really trying to get beyond the narrowness of
the European path.
Right, because the medieval epoch is the epoch of fragmentation, where every different group went its own direction. And there's a lot to be learned, an enormous amount to be learned about medievalism by seeing the different forms it takes.
I'm still intrigued by Smith's use of the term centripetal and centrifugal. Like I said, I encountered it 50 years ago in the writings of a mystic. I thought this is a curious use of terminology in philosophic concepts. And Smith was the first one I've come across since then who used those terms in that way.
Yeah, it's going to come up a lot over the course of this.
Well, you got the yin and yang, and certainly it's different, but there's it's another dichotomy.
Yeah. Well, today's focus is Pico della Mirandola. We're gonna talk about Pico, and part of the reason we're going to talk about him is people are always surprised when Kenneth Smith relentlessly brings his name up as one of the most important figures at the boundary. Boundary not being fixed, not being Platonic, but as part of the revolution of modernism that arose out of medievalism. Why does he talk about Pico? What did Pico have to say? What was Pico's relationship to other philosophers? If he was just this obscure guy, and he seems to us, based on our education, then he wouldn't be worth talking about necessarily.
Could I ask, like, why was he so obscure? I mean, like, when you read him, it just seems like it was very important. I mean, was there an effort to silence him in some sense, or was it just that people didn't pick it up, for some strange reason?
Yes, his 900 Theses were judged a heresy, and it was the first completely banned book from the medieval. We think about the Dark Ages as being an era of banning books, but the truth is that didn't happen very much until the rise of the modern epoch. Around the same time the Inquisitions are kicking off, you're also getting more banning of books, more witch hunting, more chasing down of heresies, and it's a sign of the medieval power structure falling apart. When it gets desperate and starts wielding its power to try to hang on is when it drives away people and launches the revolution against itself. So you'll find...
This is the funny thing, the whole witch burning era was a product of modern times.
Exactly. Yeah. Many of the things that we associate with the Dark Ages are actually associated with us. The way we teach history, in order not to come to grips with that, the way we teach the history of that period is very warped, because moderns, just like any other epoch, prefers not to paint itself in an unflattering light, i.e. an honest light. We want to heap scorn upon those old or primitive eras and heap all the blessings on ourselves.
Well, when the Enlightenment got its chance to sit in the pilot's seat, it gave us the French Revolution.
That's right.
And I mean, I wonder about Metternich. Metternich so feared the chaos that was presented there, he wanted to continue the church and state.
Yes.
And unfortunately, this is a question. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Nazi Germany are all products of the end of that old system of church and state. And when the world gets taken over by the common man, and what does he deliver?
That's right. Yeah, we're gonna explore this, and it all starts. For us, the reason that we're picking Pico is that even though he's obscure to us, he wasn't obscure at the time. He said he wanted to debate every leading figure. He wanted to call a great symposium and bring together all the greatest philosophers and thinkers and have them debate him publicly and have the whole thing recorded. And his basis for doing that was, on the one hand, that he was very widely read. what we're going to discover when we look at Pico is that just about every major interesting thread that went into the Renaissance passed through Pico. He was what we later would call a Renaissance man. He read voraciously, and he was reading at a time when an increasing volume of the Latin, the Roman and Greek writers was coming through Arab translations into Europe. And so there was this kind of explosion of excitement around being confronted with these amazing thinkers from a bygone epoch who, as far as many readers could conclude, like including Pico, they were better thinkers than anybody had been for 1,000 years. They're like, if we represent God's chosen people and living according to God's plan, how come they're smarter than we are? Was this enormous philosophical crisis that was happening around the Renaissance. And Pico explicitly talks about it. Phil, go ahead, you got your hand up.
Yeah, do you think that, as you say that, a thought came to mind, it's almost as if, like, back at that time, early time, that transitional time, they had already read Hegel, that things are always changing. And when you're in the process of change, you're always out in the limb, so to speak. But when you're out in the limb, you're nervous and you're always looking for, like, the safety rope, right? To tie it together, to hold it together. Whereas if you are, let's say, at the tree trunk, you feel safe. And so therefore, it seems to me modernity has always been out in the limb, so to speak, if you want to think in terms of freedom. And so therefore, you always have a counterpoint force that is the rope that ties it all together. Don't worry, you're safe. Right? That kind of. I'm just wondering. It just almost seems like they have already understood that. It turns out maybe we don't like change so much, right? It's like, could we just like keep it the same? Like, we know what's going on when it's the same, even though it's not great, but nonetheless, we know what's going on. And so I just wonder whether that's not an addiction that humanity is smart enough to understand that. Was you're a wild animal, you don't quite understand that. You just kind of go on as it is. So just a thought. So Pico, definitely, if that's the case, that's already indication of a kind of pre-modern thinking that, no, we got to keep this guy quiet, right? Because like he is getting us way out on the limb.
Yeah. What we'll see is that it wasn't his goal to start a revolution. He just wanted to up the medieval game. He didn't fully appreciate he knew that he was very aware of his own specialness, like Nietzsche would be later. He knew he was doing something interesting. And he wasn't shy about that. But his approach to it was entirely about, look at all these amazing people who have accomplished amazing things. His 900 theses, as you'll see, 402 of them are theses drawn from the works of other philosophers and writers. And then he adds 500 of his own to try to weave it together into a new kind of coherent tapestry. That's what he's trying to be, is an integrator or a syncretist. He's trying to pull the wisdom from all the sources together and make a coherent picture from it. And in order to do that, he has to postulate a few things, which is why all of the thinkers before only get 400 theses and he gets 500. There's a lot of work in the weaving, right? So we'll come to this, but part of why he makes moderns uncomfortable is that, like Newton and like a lot of our other founding figures, he included many things that we have since discarded, and included them not just as appendixes, but as central to his arguments. So you're going to find out what we're going to talk about today is this idea of man as an unfinished animal, this myth that Kenneth Smith alludes to. We're going to see what the myth is. I'll tell you right off the bat, it involves those hierarchies of angels that the medievals laid out, and it involves the top 3 levels of the angels and what man's role in relationship is to them. Now, this is the sort of thing that any medieval would go, well, that makes sense. But a modern would go, what? How is the basis of the modern order erected upon angels? This you're going to get accountants and MBAs and scientists all uniting against that, going, no, keep angels to your private religious stuff. That doesn't belong at the centerpiece of math and logic and science and the justification for the great brave new world we're going into. It feels too much like it's a continuation of the old world. And that's what makes it so interesting, is that we don't really want to talk about him because he's got all this medieval stuff. But the Pope didn't want him going around talking because he had all this modern stuff. And he's got them together in the same mix. Mm-hmm. It's like we said when we talked about the way that the medieval order broke away from the ancient order. At the beginning, each of these epochs is so enmeshed in the previous epoch that it's almost unrecognizable compared to what it's going to be towards the middle of the epoch when it comes into its own. There's an enormous transformation that happens as a result of gaining power, where they start to discover how much of my own, the epoch says, how much of my own justification for things, how much of my own explanation of how things work has to depend on the old order, and how much can I free it from that, like Michelangelo trying to carve the statues free. How much can I come into my own and be my own epoch that doesn't depend on the previous epoch? And transitional figures like Pico make everybody really uncomfortable because they firmly stand in both camps, and that violates our noetic desire to sort things into pure, tidy categories. It's Hegel all over the place, saying that there is a continuity from the bud to the blossom to the fruit, and that continuity is so organic it makes us uncomfortable. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I have a comment on a question.
Please.
And in response to Phil, when you're out on the limb, Phil, that's where the fun is. That's where the change begins. That's where you grow. That's where you learn. And if you fall, you trust yourself that you have enough experience and confidence that you'll land standing up. That's how I see it. So change is a good thing.
Well, good for you.
So the second thing, we know that the good thing about us as human race and as animals, if you have two dogs, they have different temperaments. If you have two cats, they have different temperaments. And so it takes a mixture to be in the world. And that's just the way I see it, probably because I've always lived at the edge. When you're an anesthesiologist, you're always at the edge. Yes. And you got to get accustomed to it. So the second thing I wanted to say is I found this Pico a very interesting guy, and I want you to comment on what I'm about to say, Rick. So in trying to understand philosophy, I tried to interpret the utterances of the philosopher in their background. Yes. And this guy was a rich aristocrat, right? So at 23, he's writing this 900 thesis because he was viewed as a child prodigy.
Yes.
So after I read some of it, one of the things I came away with, and these two words stuck in my mind, as you know, I like to focus in. He focused on humanist syncretism. Yes. So I noticed he went back to the old order. He took some from the medieval times. And then, even though he was not quite in the modern times, just at the very edge of it, 1463 to 1494, he tried to project into the modern time.
Yes.
So he took some of the teachings of Plato, Aristotle, and what fascinated me was his endorsement of mysticism.
Yes.
And that I thought was probably why he was viewed as a heretic. So I want your comment on that, because I think Stephen talked about the witch burning and said those are moderns, but if this guy died in 1494, we're already looking at witchcraft as something that was odd and threatening.
So what you're going to find as we go into this is that you would think the church would be offended by the exploration of the Kabbalah and things like that, but they didn't have a problem with that. What they were angry about is he wrote theses attacking Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas was like a great saint and centerpiece of medieval theology. To go after Aquinas felt like to the church to go after the foundations of their entire world order, their whole theology. And they couldn't have that. They literally, it didn't matter whether his arguments against Aquinas were good or not. What mattered is you're not allowed to touch that. And so that was their very first pushback, was against those theses. And the reason is that you got to remember that at this period, the scholars who were doing what Pico was doing took an encyclopedist approach. They were collectors, or you might think of it as an Alexandrian, Library of Alexandria type approach. They were collectors. They were finding other people who said things, and then they were trying to make sense of it. And that, not only in its own terms, but also compared to other things that they'd collected. They were trying to make a big, pretty picture. And it was very confusing because a lot of this stuff had been lost and was only recently coming up. The church, just like everybody else, was way behind in trying to assess, the relative merits of this philosopher versus that philosopher versus what happens if you try to put them together. Like, you'll see that Pico was confident that he could 100% reconcile Plato and Aristotle, which is madness because Aristotle was a major critic of Plato. It's like Aristotle himself says, boy, that Plato's got some problems. Let me tell you all about them. And Pico's busy going, no, they totally get along together. It's a perfect mesh, right? He's desperately trying to make all the pieces of what turns out to be a whole bunch of separate puzzles all fit into one great big mosaic, even if he has to pound it with a hammer. And that activity is difficult and confusing. It requires hopping between multiple perspectives and trying to weld them together. And nobody in the church hierarchy was qualified to evaluate whether any of that was heresy. It was all to them, it was very abstruse. It was too new, too unexamined. But Aquinas, that was solid ground for the church. They knew that well. And that's where they went after it. They said, okay, now you're in our territory and you're not allowed to be here. So, later, you remember what we said when the medieval revolution happened, they came out of the gate with 17 horses instead of one horse. Like, there's multiple sects of Christianity running at the same time, plus other things that weren't Christianity at all. And that kept going all the way through the end, despite the church's efforts, not the church, but the medieval power structure's efforts to suppress the alternatives. So their efforts to suppress heresy tended to have a first ignoring, then concerned, then overreacting, and then moving on quality to it. It was sporadic. It was not systematic. This is before industrialization. The idea of carefully designed, logically structured, rigorous, relentless purification doesn't arise until modernism. So they're sort of just reacting to this or that or the other thing. So this is why the Inquisition is a modern phenomenon and not a medieval phenomenon, because the Inquisition is when they got really organized about trying to stamp out heresy. And they became systematized and they put together recipe books for how to do it and what are the areas we're concerned about, and we'll send in inquisitors. And when Pico's writing, they haven't got their act together industrially yet. They haven't figured out how to do this in a coherent fashion. So it's kind of, I always think about jellyfish. My favorite animals in the history of evolution are jellyfish. And the reason for that is they are the phylum that developed the very first nervous system, the very first muscular system, and the very first sophisticated sensory systems. I mean, before them, you've got sponges, which are sort of barely aware of what's going on around them and are really more of a colony in some ways than they are a coherent animal. But with jellyfish, it turns out there's huge, if you're going to be mobile, then you're going to be bumping into things. It would be nice if you noticed. So you need a sensory system to move around. You need the muscular system, and what the two need a linkage so that you can move towards the light or away from danger or what have you. And that involves the development of the nervous system. The other thing that's amazing about jellyfish is that they are the first animals that dream. They sleep and they dream. And we don't know exactly why, but we do know that this is the first thing that spends a bunch of its time taking in input from the world. So here's the thing. Among jellyfish, you've got the ones with eyes and you got the ones without eyes. The ones without eyes are a whole lot less effective as predators. They're sort of blindly bumbling along, and then they feel something. And sort of long after, from our perspective as things with vision and hearing, long after they should have seen something coming, they're like, whoa, what's that? And all of a sudden they go into motion and try to respond. And it's, if it's a predator that's about to eat them, it's too late. The sea turtles, prey upon these things because they're like, do, ow, I'm being eaten. It's like, who could have foreseen this? But as predators, it's the same way. Do, oh, I caught a fish. Quick, grab the fish. There is this last minute, you should have been ready a long time ago for this quality to the jellyfish that don't yet have eyes. This is what
Oedipus, blindness.
Oedipus, right? This is Oedipus's sin, is that he doesn't see where he's come from or where he's going. He's like the early jellyfish. So the medieval approach to heresy was a lot like the early jellyfish, in the sense that there's heresy literally coming out of the starting gate side by side with them, and they're only half aware of it. And as the epoch goes on, they keep sort of not noticing it and then bumping into it and then overreacting. And then when it's not immediately next to
you've got the printing press, so the books are circulating. Heresy for Dummies, how to get started.
Yes. Once the printing press comes along and starts capturing people's thoughts in writing, it gets harder to ignore. Once they start actually cataloging where are different groups inhabiting and what are they saying and what's their theology, then they start to get a lot more methodical. They can start to industrialize their inquisitions and their stamping out of heresy.
So can I make one more question I have, though, because in the information I was reading, they said that Pico really ran into a fair amount of controversy when he endorsed astrology, because it challenged the concept of man's free will, which was a major point of, should I say, foundation, which was a major foundational point at that
whole
time.
Theology.
Yes.
The whole theology depends on it.
So that's where he probably had the biggest pushback from the establishment.
His thing with astrology is that the medieval epoch itself had a contradiction on this. Because on the one hand, they drew their picture of the heavens from astrologers, right? Or like Ptolemy and others created this astrological view of the heavens of, these concentric spheres and the earth at the center and this whole thing. And they spent 1,000 years creating sermons about the relationship between man and God that depended upon all this astrological worldview to be in place. But on the other hand, they didn't want that to actually determine your free will, because then that would mean that you didn't get to choose to freely go with God. And if that were the case, that would make God evil, since he set all this in motion. And they couldn't have that. So for God to be good, we had to be able to freely choose, which meant the part of astrology that's about it controlling our behavior, that couldn't be real. But the other part had to be real. You see what I mean? They sort of embraced half of it and rejected half of it, and tried not to notice that they were drawing, that the thing that they hated and the thing that they depended on both came from the same source. And here's Pico blundering along saying, I'm going to make a big coherent picture out of all this. And they're going, no, for the love of God, don't put those two things together. We've spent 1,000 years trying not to ever notice that they go together, because this contradiction is something that they inherited from coming out of the gate in the beginning. And they never could reconcile it. And here comes this, enfant terrible, reading all this stuff and saying, hey, did you ever notice that these two things? They're like, shut up, for the love of God, shut up. Don't do that. So if he was more modest, if he hadn't challenged all the leading lights to a debate, if he hadn't put his stuff down in writing coherently, they could have happily ignored him. It was his determination to be visible and documented and to point out all the weaknesses in the medieval theology, regardless of the fact that he was trying to fix them, right? Because he wasn't trying to do a revolution. He's trying to say, look, all this stuff is fixable. Let me show you how. But they don't even want to talk about it. So they didn't want it fixed. They didn't want it talked about. They didn't want anybody going anywhere near it. And that was also, so you're right. Astrology is a piece of this. Attacking Aquinas is a piece of this. Pretty much everywhere he went, he was like a bull in a china shop. Saying,
was he also the one who said that all humanity worshiped the same God, just in different forms? Was he the one who said that? And that did not go over well.
I don't know. Maybe he did. I don't know. I didn't fully get all the way through the reading before.
Because that caught my attention, because this is one of the things that I believe, in religious pluralism. I think all the doctrines say approximately the same thing. It just depends on which one you want to pick. So yeah. I found that very interesting that he was endorsing this in the 15th century. Yes.
Yes.
So that's and for me.
He's drawing off of older threads. He's drawing off of Jewish traditions. He's drawing off Muslim traditions. And, you can't read a whole lot of Plato and Aristotle and other classical writers without a certain amount of polytheism seeping in. Mm-hmm. That tolerance for other religions that was so central to the ancient worldview, it permeates every sentence they write where they talk about the soul or the spirit or the nature of the divine. And so, yeah, I mean, by trying to reconcile these things, by not being willing to put up hard, firm walls about what is wanted and what is not wanted, mm-hmm. by defying the law of the excluded middle, he was bound to get in trouble in all kinds of different ways. But it's fascinating that he didn't fully see it coming.
He was too young.
Well, he went to university. Remember, another one of the contradictions of the late medieval era is that they were embarrassed by their encounter with Islam during the Crusades, and they felt like they had to catch up by starting a university systems, upgrading the old monastic colleges to become actual centers of learning. The moment, this is a thing we see today in the United States, the moment that you start allowing people to exchange ideas freely, they start developing a pesky ecumenical pluralism and tolerance of diversity that really pisses off fundamentalists, whether it's the medieval church or today's fundamentalists. It is impossible not to notice things when you start comparing different philosophical systems, which is why totalitarian regimes like the medieval orthodoxy, they are desperate to prevent you from encountering those alternative systems, because the moment you do, you're lost. It's 99% of people spend some time with Muslims, they're going to start to notice that they have an awful lot of things in common. Rather than they're the enemy and they must be destroyed. That's easy to say if you've never met one, but you start spending time with Muslims and you're like, wait, you're monotheist too? And wait, you also revere Jesus? And all these confusing things that they've never been prepared for. And it starts to get them thinking outside of the narrow frame that's been rigidly imposed upon them. So the thing that's interesting about the period leading into the Renaissance is that everything that arose that the hierarchy hated was something that in some sense the hierarchy itself had already set in motion. It's its own fault that these things came out the way that they did. And it's because they kept all these contradictions inside of themselves and thought they could just wall them off and say, you're not allowed to ask these questions, and then everything will be fine. As long as we don't actually say, isn't the guy who said all these concentric spheres is how the world works, which you believe, the same guy who said, and they control our personality? Isn't this the same guy? And the church is like, shut up, shut up, shut up. The rigidity, the need for compartmentalization as a solution is an example of something that the powerful reach for because they have the power to seemingly enforce it. It seems like an easy way to solve what would otherwise be very, a problem leading to very uncomfortable discussions and possibly to disrupting the way of
political control. We're back to that.
We're back to that. But the problem is that the medieval epoch is pre-industrial. They can't manufacture consent. They don't have a mass media, to help guide people's thoughts. They don't have mass education and other methods to manufacture, generic personalities that they can shape. There's simply too much. The irony of the medieval epoch is the lack of control of the would-be totalitarians creates an epoch that is a weird mix of, in the one sense, less freedom, because if they catch you, they'll burn you. But on the other sense, more freedom, because they probably won't catch you unless you shoot your mouth off, because they just don't have that much control.
Yeah.
It's not until the modern epoch that we learn how to put in place what we wanted to do in the medieval epoch to really stamp out totalitarian solutions, and although, as we see, even those fall apart, even with all of our industrial power. So this is the contradiction that's happening right at the Renaissance, is the people who most want to have totalitarian control simply lack the industrial capacity to do so. And they've really unleashed enfant terribles like Pico upon themselves by educating them and exposing them to new ideas. It's like, this is a tragedy from the perspective of the medieval power structure that was a long time coming. And, anybody could see it coming once they actually see the threads that are involved here. It's no accident that the medieval epoch gave birth to the modern epoch.
Okay.
Phil,
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, thank you for your expose about this, because it does say so much about Hegel and the relationship with the dialectic. In other words, it emerges out of the unresolved, let's say, unresolved tension that existed. What it also showed me was how it connects to my own work. Like,
yes,
I didn't realize, because my whole stuff is really about dialectic. And to mention your favorite thing, animal is the jellyfish. My favorite animal, in some sense, is the spider. And as you know, my paintings is about the fallen angels, right? The fallenness. Yes. But there was always a problem in my situation, because like, I knew that I was not, on the one hand, situated in an organized religion, but I always felt that there was something very spiritual about what I was talking about. And it seems like the fallen angel is one part of it that's being on earth. And the spider is a good symbol, because what told me about it was about Pico trying to weave together these cross strains. And Plato talked about the weaving, right? And a spider is exactly the animal that weaves the web together to create a new structure. You would say a civilization of its own, right? But it's kind of, on the one hand, it's also full of hole. But on the other hand, it's also like, unfortunately, the structure is floating in the air unless you attach it to something. That is something else, right? In other words, if you cut the ties, then it just flows away and it's totally free floating, but nonetheless, it's not connected. I remember there's one painting which I made maybe about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, that was unconsciously talking about this, because I put the spider web in the structure of the halo. Right, many of my fallen angels have a halo, and I think in it, what I was trying to do was somehow connect. Now, once again, unconsciously, but now I recognize it, unconsciously connect a kind of spiritual dimension to the fallenness, earthly dimension of existence. Yes. And in some sense, it also connected to the fact that if I was spiritual, I was probably at best a pantheist, because I actually believe that it's not floating out, in the celestial heavens, although in some sense I do tend to think that way, but it's somehow situated in the physical substance itself, so that it's actually brought. So in some sense, you could say Christ is brought down to earth. It just seems like, to put it that way, make me realize that connection, because many people recognize my stuff is very spiritual. They say religious. In fact, I used to say the triangle between philosophy, art, and religion. I dropped the religion and said the human spirit, in this case, still the spiritual aspect of it. And in some sense, my sister, she's so against religion. Every time somebody asks us, and she's there, and she said, no, right? And I didn't want to say religion, so okay, yeah, I kind of agree with it. But I think there is something in the fact that human beings have to have this deeper connection beyond just the mere physical, but the physical could be in the spiritual realm. And I think that connects it together in a structure that tethers it together rather than a spider web that creates this marvelous civilization, but is sort of unconnected. And I could see it in society now, and in particularly in the market, that somehow it has a very strong architecture, but it's disconnected to what the reality really is. And I think human beings need that connection on some level. And on some level, it doesn't have to be a religious level, but it has to do with something that transcends this sort of physical need as well. Of course, we need both. But I think that's where the problem might be in terms of a modern society, that we have flushed out the spiritual side, and the ones that are sort of like still hanging on to religion is hanging on to a dead spiritual structure rather than something that really believes in something else. And I think that that's why I probably moved away from my earlier work, because I felt that I had gone far enough in terms of the dialectical dimension of abstract art, although I still believe in it quite a lot. But I had to add that other element that I always believed in, it was incomplete. And so I think, and so many people could say, well, this is a little too religious for us, you're conservative. But in fact, maybe you could say that, but in fact, I'm not, because I really believe in the creative potential of human beings, of the spider to create the web, because we have created a tremendous productive web of existence. But there is this other thing that we feel, I think humanity in general, whether you're on the left, right, center, or wherever, that there's something a little bit missing. And I think people are beginning to discover that something is missing. So thank you for for making that connection a little bit more concrete, because I've always thought that was the case. But now I understand that it was situated in that particular painting that I recognized, but I also didn't recognize.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Phil. So I'm going to call on Stephen, but after Stephen, I want to come back to this post that he put in the chat, where he talks about the highest orders, the middle orders, and the lowest orders of the angels, because Pico's grand myth of what it means to be human plays directly into this hierarchy that Stephen's posted there. So it's really relevant. But first, go ahead, Stephen, whatever it was you wanted to talk about.
Well, we have Jasper's concept, how in ancient Greece, the flourishing that suddenly appeared at that time it's unusually powerful. Jaspers calls it the Axial Age. And it actually started in the Middle East and came to Greece. But the ancient Greeks flourish on the spectacular scale compared to the rest of the old world. I don't know, Europe falls into a dark ages for a long extended period. And then again, we see a spectacular flourishing at the beginning of what we call modern times. Now, this just, you look at the people that appeared, you know, you look at people like Shakespeare, and suddenly there's a degree of intelligence there. You're not really going to find the match today. These individuals that could just sit there and work their brain and come up with stuff. It's as though it suddenly appears as huge flowering, but it's been declining since then. Even the period of German idealism was one of the last great periods of thought. And then a sort of decadence seems to start setting in the middle of the 19th century. We don't have the sort of intellectual activity that was going on in those earlier centuries. It's like we no longer have these peak intellects. Whether it's societies tend to, in the end, decide that these smart alecks, we want to get rid of them. Maybe that's it. We don't like these smart alecks. Let's burn them at the stake or destroy them. So why did we see this sudden flourishing of the intellect out of nowhere in the late medieval and early modern times?
Well, you know, what's interesting is that, you know, from a European perspective, what I'm reminded of is the metaphor of flatland, not understanding what happens when a sphere passes through its plane. It's like, it seems like a dot comes out of nowhere and then it grows into a circle and then it shrinks back to a dot and then it goes to nowhere. And what the hell just happened? And the explanation is you can't understand it in 2 dimensions. You need the 3rd dimension in order to explain what happened. Otherwise, it seems like this mystical explosion out of nowhere. So when we go beyond European history, we find that Arabic history, and not just Arabic, although we tend to use that as an umbrella, but digging more deeply, Persian history and Syrian history, there is a scientific flourishing that happens long before it reaches Europe. They are, because of the fad that gets launched in the Islamic world to start what they called houses of wisdom and houses of knowledge, and for the different caliphates to compete for who had the most impressive house of wisdom, who had the best scholars. It led to this arms race of knowledge and learning in the Islamic world at a time when more or less the opposite was happening in Europe. And it's only after Europe gets up close and personal with that through the Crusades and really starts to see these things and really starts to have more discussion, rather than walling off those people as all heathens and heretics. Once they actually start having a conversation, they discover that it's possible to be devoutly religious and incredibly educated at the same time, which was unthinkable for a long time. The medieval art.
That flourishing was impressive, but it was like a firecracker compared to what happened in Europe after that. And the other question is, why in Western civilization do we see these superior intellects? We don't really have them today anymore.
Well, we'll come to that, but first we have to talk about this issue of the relative importance, because one of the things that you're going to see in Pico della Mirandola is that he, you know, I shared this chart of, you know, in which the different theses he made are grouped by what they're about. What is it? What is he focusing on? What is his core argument about those sources? And what you'll see over and over is that he's impressed by their logic, by their intelligence, by the coherency with which they seem to offer a cosmological view. But even with the Arabs, what he's not impressed by, and basically is not noticing at all, is the way that the Arabs have figured out the enormous Achilles heel of the Romans and the Greeks. The Arabs by this point have noticed that many of the most compelling and persuasive arguments of antiquity are false, and that the only way to find out is to test it against reality. Mm-hmm. They are discovering that intellectualism is a trap that can lead you to conclude things because they seem persuasive to you that are nevertheless 100% false. They can be logical, they can be rational, they can be incredibly erudite and persuasive and still 100% wrong. This is something the Greeks and the Romans didn't understand. They were way too focused on the life of the mind. They'd lost touch with gnosis, with the importance of being immersed in the world and letting the world bang on your ideas and knock away the beautiful but false ideas and leave only the good ones that are grounded in what's actually true. The Arabs didn't want to discover that any more than the Europeans wanted to discover it. But because these Arab scholars are translating Aristotle and all of these other writers, and then trying they accident when they're trying to recreate it to prove how great it is, some of it's coming out false, and it launches this whole movement.
Translating Europeans.
Well, more importantly, they're translating Greeks and Romans, who are at that point in history unintelligible to the Europeans, right? The rest of the Europeans are not. They aren't reading Aristotle.
They're translating Europeans from an earlier epoch.
Yes, but the earlier epoch is different in kind.
They're translating Western civilization Mark I. Apparently, we're in Mark II, which is going the same way, apparently.
Well, I think you get a different picture of things once you trace the threads through here, because what we're seeing is that the differences between the ancient and medieval epochs were much, much, much greater than the differences between Arabic and European civilization per se. Because in the medieval epoch, European and Arabic civilization both had lost access to all of that ancient knowledge. The Arabs do it first. They go back to it and look at it again, but because of the way that they approach it, it forces them to discover science, which the ancient epoch had never really discovered. The ancient epoch had engineering, but their engineering was still heavily grounded in rationalism. And the people in the Alexandrian age, who you will now see, shows like Cosmos, talking about how brilliant they are and they're forerunners of the modern epoch, because they're doing actual science, they're still not doing it the way that the Arabs and the way we would do it later. Oh. They're heavily relying on, a lot of slaves. They're relying on their inventiveness, on showing off how smart they are. Their focus is the human mind. And it's the Arabs that discover that the human mind has to be tempered by the world itself. Mm-hmm. You have to get in a conversation with nature that allows nature to tell you you're wrong. And if you're not willing to do that, if you're too determined to seem like a smarty pants, then most of what you say is going to be false, no matter how many people you convince. So the reason I'm stressing this is that this is the enormous breakthrough that the Arabs are making that hasn't been made before in this line of descent. And yet, among the smartest people in Europe at that time, Pico della Mirandola, widely read, he doesn't notice because he's not ready for that lesson. He's such a medieval. He's so focused on rationality and deducing from God and from the theology what the proper conclusions are. That's his approach to thinking and reason. So he doesn't see the value of empiricism. It can be right in front of him. He's looking right at it. He's reading Avicenna. There it is in Avicenna's writings. And all he can see is that Avicenna is a smarty pants. He's a smart guy, and I like smart guys, and so I'm going to quote Avicenna, and I'm going to tell you how smart he is. But he doesn't notice that Avicenna is saying, but it doesn't matter how smart I am. What matters is that I'm subjecting my ideas to testing, that I'm putting them into the laboratory, and I'm going to find out how many of my smarty pants ideas are actually stupid and wrong, no matter how good they sound. This, even at this pivotal moment in the launch of the Renaissance, Pico still can't hear it. It's just too alien. So when I say he stands with a foot in both worlds, the medieval and the modern, and of course he's looking back at the ancients, but he's doing it from a medieval perspective that doesn't permit him to recognize what the big revolutionary thing is that's going on. So for us, the danger when we hear that Pico della Mirandola is this prophet of the modern age, we expect him to be like us. He must have been an empiricist, right? Alongside freedom and free will and rational exploration, all that, he must have been empirical. But when we look at his theses, that's not what we find at all. He's pre-empirical. He's still medieval. So Sharon, go ahead.
So I want to follow up on that because I read that this weekend and I found it fascinating that Pico's exploration of natural philosophy allowed for the development of natural science, which led to empiricism.
Yes.
So he was actually his exploration and the way he delved with the natural philosophy led to these two other disciplines.
He's a gateway to it.
Yes, he was a gateway. That's the right word. That's the way I saw it. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about Phil and about the soul and God, because I was also reading something that I found fascinating. It's called God and Anatomy. And there's a concept that say God doesn't have a form. And the only time that, and in Christianity, they said, and God became man, and that man was Jesus. But the pictures that we see of man created, and I'm going to speak for Christianity because that's what I am, are our own imagination.
Right.
And Jesus, because Christianity was a white religion, he had blonde hair and blue eyes, even though he came from the Middle East. Right. Right. And I remember as you go from the north to the south of Italy, Jesus got some color by the time got to the south. That's right. So the form and image of God, it can be said it is man, because God made man in his own image. And that's why man has the power or the need for divinity or the expression of divinity, right? So, and I saw Stephen's hierarchy there. Yes. And I thought, and I don't know, I'm trying to understand it, because God, in my eyes, is formless.
But what he's captured here is the medieval framework for angels. And it was widely accepted. And it's what's interesting about it is that, and this goes back to what Stephen was bringing up, this is where the nexus is. What were people prepared to understand and not prepared to understand when they encountered these ideas that were coming to them from the ancient epoch, or were coming to them from the scientific revolution happening in the Arabic and Persian world? One note I'd like to make: we tend to conflate all the scholars under the Arabic religion, under the Islamic religion, with Arabic. But the truth is that there were subgroups, racial and cultural subgroups within Islam. For example, the Persians in particular had because of Zoroastrianism, which goes back forever, like Hinduism, they have a very ancient tradition of scholarship. And it's no coincidence that when you browse through many of the sort of what we would later call Renaissance men of the earlier Dark Ages, who in the Arabic world are discovering chemistry, discovering optics, discovering medicine, partially through translating Galen and others, but partially through subjecting them to test and learning to winnow out the parts of the rational arguments that were false and the parts that bear up to empirical scrutiny. When you look at these people, what's interesting is that, maybe they all speak Arabic, but a lot of them are Persian, some of them are Syrian, and the reasons for that go back to long forgotten traditions of scholarship in these different areas. And sometimes the pushback against those sort of empirical investigations, sometimes they were religious pushbacks, just like they were in Europe. You'll find times when there are Arabic Muslim scholars who are criticizing these Islamic scientists because they're not sure where this is all leading. Just like in Europe, they really weren't sure where this was all leading and they didn't like it at all. In the Arab world, there was some of that too. There was some back and forth. There was some struggles and tug of wars about, how far can we go in questioning.
The Arab world succeeded in nipping it in the bud.
Only later. During the era that we're talking about, it was Europe that was nipping it in the bud, and it was the Arab world in which it was allowed to flourish. So there's an inversion that happens. What you're referring to, Stephen, you're thinking about more recent history. During the period we're talking about, it was exactly the other way around. It was Europe that was trying to play catch up.
But how well received was Averroes amongst the Muslim scholars of the time?
It depended on who was present to criticize them. When there weren't charismatic critics, the Islamic scientists would do really well. I mean, Avicenna, you can read up on his history. You can read up on a number of these guys. A lot of them thrived, and the reason was that these houses of wisdom, where some of them worked, or who sponsored them, were really I don't know how to say it. They had enormous cachet value for some of these caliphates who wanted to prove. Remember, the caliphates are arguing amongst themselves about who's most representing Muhammad's teachings. And they've fractured and they can't agree amongst themselves about who's being more authentic. So they've got a competition going amongst themselves in a way kind of different from the way it happens in Europe. In Europe, there's more of a, there's the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Orthodox Church, but the Roman Orthodox Church really holds sway over all of Western Europe. Whereas in the Muslim world in this period, there's a number of different caliphates, and none of them can seem to come out on top. They can't quite establish. So as a result, instead of just totalitarian domination, they have to find other ways to compete. And one of the ways that they compete is who makes the best architecture, who has the most incredible, mathematical geometric art, who has the best houses of learning. They find these other ways to compete with each other. And a side effect of that is that it allows the first real flowering we see in the Mediterranean kind of complex of civilizations. The first real flowering we see of straight up empiricism. The first time that empiricism is treated not as some minor detail of rationality, but as being a necessary critic of rationality. For the first time, people are looking at intellectualism and reason and going, God, that can lead us astray just as well as it can lead us to the truth. We have a real problem here, right? They see it clearly. These occasional people who are able to break free and do these investigations, they've got the first clear critique of the limits of human reason and the desperate need to let nature guide us, to help us winnow out all the bad ideas from the few good ones. Heraclitus says the same thing, but he says it in his gnomic, cryptic way that was too easy for others who came later to ignore. And so you've got Plato and Aristotle, having being much more confused about the powers of reason than Heraclitus was. But these Arabic scholars, these Persian scholars, these Islamic scholars, they're leaving no doubt. They're writing careful manuscripts that say, here is what so-and-so of the ancient world said, and here is the experiment that I conducted. You can do it yourself. Here's the equipment I made, and here's how long I did this thing. And look at the result. It didn't come out at all like he said it would. Oh my goodness. It looks like, even though this is the most compelling argument any of us has ever heard, it's still false, right? And that is, that is one of the major turning points in natural history. So like Sharon says, Pico then ends up leading to the entrance or re-entrance of empiricism into Europe, but he himself doesn't understand it and doesn't see it. He looks at these natural philosophers, and what he sees are geniuses. Mm-hmm. He says, oh, how come we don't have geniuses like this anymore? How come these guys are so, we should be smart too. He doesn't understand that smarts is not the issue, right? And you could see why, because he was so frustrated by the powers that be. The hierarchies around him were behaving in stupid, venal, corrupt ways. It was when that's the problem in your face, it's easy to miss the most important thing that's happening because it's not as dramatized by conflict. So he doesn't fully understand what he's bringing in. And of course, he's not single-handedly bringing it all in either. A lot of it's coming through the university system. People whose names we never learned are passing on some of this stuff as well as people whose names are documented but only in footnotes. So there's a whole movement of kind of bringing in, on the one hand, this resurgence of rationality and intellectualism, going back to Platonism. But on the other hand, this new flower is coming in alongside it, not fully seen for what it is, which is this blossoming of empiricism as a necessary critic of reason. Phil, you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of points. It seems to me like the Islam was not simply an Arab religion, because the Persians were a very important part of it.
Right.
And the Persians, of course, were Aryans, which means they're connected, at least racially, to the Vedic culture of India. So that so there's some relationship going on there. Now that's a question I do not know enough about, but nonetheless, I know there's a connection.
Yes.
And so I just wonder to what degree Zoroastrianism, how connected that is to the Vedic underlying structure of philosophy and thinking that's connected to Hinduism in some sense that manifests. The other thing I want to mention is sort of like, I think the Greeks never really quite saw the possible synthesis between Parmenides and Heraclitus.
Right.
And so which could have created a different structure. And I think what happened was, I think my thought is that probably in some ways Plato was somewhat sympathetic to Heraclitus, but he went eventually with Parmenides because there was a kind of a structure that's there. And I wonder what would have happened if that dichotomy had not allowed for it to be more Hegelian, let's put it that way. And I was pointing out that, you know, the Greek philosopher, let's see, Anaxagoras, not Anaximander, Anaxagoras, you know, who talked about the quantifiable and the unquantifiable, right? Yes. And that in some sense, that was still under the umbrella of quantified, mathematical structure of quantifiability, but nonetheless, that seems to be somewhat at least amenable to sort of some kind of compromise. That I think that he was not also given a chance to fully flower his thing that might have mediated. The third thing I want to mention is I wonder whether there isn't a limit to human intellect in the sense that we can no longer, it's not even so much modernity, but I wonder whether we could even have true intellectual to have a kind of cosmological or pantheistic understanding of the whole. And maybe that's why modernity developed this sort of structure of specialization, because specialization is sort of an instrumental division of intellect into a kind of technology that produces, how should I say, efficiency and production that allow for civilization. And I wonder whether, you know, I saw a couple videos on ant colonies and termite colonies that build these incredibly complex civilizations, which the workers are very, very specialized. Yes. And they have structures that in in an organic way resemble our city planning quite a lot. And I just wonder whether that doesn't mean that once you reach a limit and you specialize in a subdiscipline of a subdiscipline, and that you never really have the ability to construct a whole that puts it together, but somehow it works in some sense, right?
Right.
But in a kind of like in your sense, the early jellyfish that bumps into things, but it seems to work somehow, right?
Yes.
And I just wonder whether it inevitably had to develop into age of specialization because we are, after all, limited. Now, there might be an out. I'm not in favor of this out. Computer technology might be able to make that link. I myself have doubts, but I also have human doubts about the ethics of it. But nonetheless, I wonder whether that isn't somehow a kind of underlying push for us to get so connected into this technology because we see our own limitations in our blind way, right? And we need help from this divine being, if you want to call it that way, to help us out to find the path into constructing this thing that may transcend the ant colony and the termite colonies. So I'm just wondering whether that's just not a disease that is not necessarily, how should I say, some tyrannical thing that in a sense is imposed upon us. I happen to feel that is, but it was an inevitable limitation of what we are. So when Pico liberated us to find ourselves, we found our limitations and we found computer technology to help us out. I just wonder, like, it's just a question that just seems to be like, maybe this is our destiny, and I don't know how to solve that, like, can we ever become like wise in today's world like Aristotle or Plato was back in his world? I don't know. I mean, like, Aristotle, in a sense, pretty much knew everything. Well, not to minute details, but it was a much more limited world. Now it's like, how many Aristotles would it take to screw in a light bulb? I don't know. I'm asking this as a question, and so it just seems like, to me, I think maybe that's why I myself am like, I guess part of the fallenness is in regard to that, because I know that the spider web is doing its thing, is very clever, but it has to be attached to something. I presume that's nature, but it has to be attached to something. Otherwise, the next little storm that come along is going to be blown into the skies. So that's my thought.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, well, that touches on so many things. There's no clear way to summarize it or to or to respond directly to it, but I'm glad you said it.
So can we go back to the text here?
Let's do that.
Because I think I hear what Phil is saying about Pico. And in the second paragraph, the first sentence, it said, Pico accepted the ancient perspective in its domain and the Christian in its realm.
Yes.
The laws of nature are valid for animals and make every animal the determinate or specific kind of being it is. Yes. Nature endowed animals to bear a natural teleology. Yes. So like compasses, they inherently point the right direction for a creature composed as they are. And I think inherently pointing that direction, I think that's still going on today. So we're still a process of evolution, and that evolution is relevant to the time in which we live. Yes. And I don't think there will ever be a finite answer, and we'll come right back to Stephen about questions and answers. I think this has been going on ad infinitum. Man will always ask questions, and the answers produce new questions. And I think this is where we're going. Pico asked a lot of questions. He got some answers, but those answers produce new questions.
Yes. Yes. Well, and part of what's interesting about Pico is that because he's a medieval, I mean, there's just like no, he may have written what Brown University calls the Manifesto of the Renaissance, but
Yes.
nevertheless, he is a medieval. He's not writing or thinking about these things the way that we would. So among the ways that you can see that is that in his era, and there is a subset of esoteric mystics to this day who think the same way Pico did, they treat all wisdom as coming from the same pool of wisdom, that there are all these wise guys that delved deeply. And as a philosopher, this mystical line of philosophy says, I too wish to be a smarty pants. And so I also want to delve deeply so I can join the pantheon that includes, these Jewish people, these Islamic people, these Christian people, these pre-Christian people, is all these different groups. It's as though they are a pantheon together. And what he wants to do is join the pantheon. He wants to be one of them. And as a result, there's a tendency to do two things. One is to treat all these different insights as more or less on the same level, more or less interchangeable. They've all got the imprimatur of smarty pants on them. And so if you want to be a smarty pants, you have to do it too. And that sometimes leads to what you see him trying to do with the syncretism, his desire to pull these different sources together into a single picture. He's got this idea that there is a single truth because he's a monotheist and he's coming out of a totalitarian epoch. He believes there's a single truth. And so if these guys are smart, they must all be tapping into that single truth. Even if they're saying it in different ways, in different languages, through different religions, it must somehow be the same one truth. And therefore, under the surface, it must all be rationally compatible. And as a preeminent rationalist, he is going to embark on the project of showing you how it all fits together into one puzzle. There is an enormous amount of unexamined hubris and will and worship of rationality involved in the idea that you couldn't be getting contradictory paradoxical things. The idea that a contradiction is false, that it's a sign of a bad argument, that's inherent in Aristotelian deductive logic. And the issue with that is that, as we know, because of the collision between the infinity of infinity of infinity of infinities of nature and the incredibly limited finitude of a human life and the amount of time we have to learn, it just isn't possible to represent all the most profound things, or even just the most important ones, in a clear, logical fashion in our head. Paradox is an inescapable side effect of attempting to map the infinite onto the finite. And so if you are attempting to describe things in a way that eliminates all paradoxes, because as a lover of logic, you've confused paradox with contradiction, then what you're going to do is suppress all the deepest truths. And you're going to be left with an illusion that's very pleasing noetically to our intellect and satisfying and seems to explain everything, a sort of theory of everything that coils back on itself and thereby excludes a whole bunch of true profound things. What I'm saying is sort of related to what Gödel's theorem says later in the 19th, early 20th century, this idea that the attempt to make the perfect rational system is doomed to fail because things that appeal to us rationally appeal to us because of their finitude. And the cosmos is infinite. And therefore we have warped the hell out of the cosmos when we have mapped it into the things that please us. This hazard of rationality, Pico doesn't understand. And so the very project he embarks upon, the way he embarks upon it, the sorts of things that he can see in the people that he's trying to draw from, and the many things that he can't see in what they've done or not done, all of that is the funhouse mirror of his own medievalism That is to say, his scholasticism, his academicism, his intellectualism, his love of logic, his love of rationality, all these things are warping what he's seeing to make it fit the pretty picture that he's trying to build out of it. And even the desire to make a system. We've talked about this with Kenneth Smith. Kenneth Smith says, I don't want to make a system. I'm not one of those philosophers who's going to give you a pretty tidy system. I'm an existentialist. And that means letting nature tell us what's true. And if nature tells us what's true, it's going to be full of paradoxes, and it's not all going to add up in ways that please us. The only way to make it all add up in ways that please us is by engaging in escapist philosophy, which is hyper intellectualized, over rationalized, very tidy, very my will gives me the right to impose my sense of pattern upon the world and make it fit. I can just hammer it until everything goes into the place I have assigned for it with my will. And the whole time that I'm engaging in this egotistical rationalist exercise, I'm going to pretend that I'm merely passing through the truth.
So I got a quick question. I hate to interrupt. So is the perspective of wisdom then situational, time and place and epoch? You know, as we put it, why are you smiling? I'm asking, that's a question I'm asking.
You're asking about what wisdom actually is.
The perception of wisdom and intellect and what is rational or irrational for that time. It's highly situational then. It's based on time and place, and I'm asking because it changes.
Right. So the first thing is Heraclitus distinguishes wisdom from everything else. So Heraclitus completely distinguishes wisdom from intellect.
Yes.
He says they're almost opposites.
Okay.
And it's hard for us as rationalists to understand that position. Because as rationalists, we think being intellectual is how you get at what's true and wise. We think that's the path. But he says the problem is that intelligence allows you to generate a private worldview of your own that nobody else has, and that also doesn't map directly onto the real world, but that makes sense to you. This is the function of intelligence, is to create these patterns. And those patterns can be false as often as they can be true. And he has some quotes where he lambasts the most respected. He goes after Homer, he goes after Hesiod. He says they should be thrown out of the schools. They're so wrong about so many things. I know you all love them and revere them because they're so smart and they're so artistic and they're so brilliant, but they're dead wrong about the things that matter. And if you don't understand that, says Heraclitus, you don't know what wisdom is. He says, wisdom stands apart from all else. Wisdom is to understand how all things are steered through all things, which is a very strange turn of phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's talking about is that the cosmos is a deeply interrelated organism that's constantly transforming according to its own lawfulness. And to be wise is to organize our minds and our cultures and our personalities and our lives in a way that puts us in harmony with that hidden harmony of the cosmos. That and only that is wisdom. Everything else we do is some other faculty of the mind at work, like noesis, right? The ability to think and plan and to make systems and models, that's all noesis, which is useful, but it's not wisdom, right? It's why noesis has to be a servant of wisdom. It can't be treated as a master who will lead us to wisdom, because it'll frequently lead us away from wisdom. So to rephrase what you said, people's ideas about what wisdom is totally vary from time to time and place to place. They're heavily influenced by what they've been raised to think is the good, right? So if you've been raised to think the good is to arrive at the true conclusions, the truth, frequently if the truth is handed down to you from a totalitarian authority, and they say, you can think as much as you like as long as you arrive at these conclusions. And if you come up with a novel way to reach those same conclusions, we will hail you as a saint, an academic, and intellectual. Well done, you, for getting to the answers we told you you had to get to. But if your exercise of the mind leads you somewhere other than to the answers that we have authorized, then you're not a good person. You're a heretic, and you're not a smarty pants. You're a problem instead of being smart. So you see, there's this practical obedience that's built into the medieval structure of what it means to be wise. Thomas Aquinas is wise because he harnesses Aristotle's logic in a way that allows you to arrive at the foregone conclusions that have been prescribed by, the hierarchies. If he used logic in a different way that would lead you away from the dogmas, then the medieval establishment would not have called him wise.
That was my question.
Right. And Aristotle, Aristotle himself had no idea he was going to be used this way, right? Nothing he did was intended either to reinforce medievalist doctrines or to overthrow them, because he didn't know they existed or what they were going to be. But he's being deployed in order to serve this function. And so as a result, all the medievals, whether they are, going along with the hierarchy or whether they're rebelling against the hierarchy, their notion of what it means to be wise has still been formatted for them by the medieval epoch, so that even when they try to rebel, they rebel in a way that's stereotypically medieval. Right? So
when Pico comes along and challenges all this wisdom, right? Or is he challenging the intellect? Which is it?
He's challenging what is imagined to be wisdom at the same time that he thinks he's being true to it. He doesn't fully understand the heresies of what he's saying. He doesn't know he's about to get in a lot of trouble because he has internalized a contradictory worldview and he doesn't know where the contradictions are. The way that the worldview keeps itself going is by steering people's minds so that they never notice the contradictions involved. Because if they notice the contradictions, the whole schema would fall apart, because they've said contradiction is a sign of falsehood, right? They came out of the gate without logic, but with contradictions and with a demand for orthodoxy. Later, they import Aristotelian logic, which has no tolerance for contradictions. But since there's contradictions in their core theology, they have to import Aristotle in a way that lays down the law to say, you are not allowed to use the logic in a way that reveals the contradictions in our orthodoxy. You can use the logic in any other way, but not that way. And poor Pico, he goes ahead and uses the logic in ways that reveal the contradictions. And he thinks he's doing medievalism a favor because he thinks he's fixing the contradictions. But the medieval orthodoxy says, we don't want you to fix the contradictions. We want you to never mention the contradictions, because even to admit we had a contradiction would be to say that we were fallible. And if we were fallible, if the Pope said something that wasn't true, that calls into question whether he's God's agent on earth. And if he's not God's agent on earth, that calls into question the entire premise of the entire political, economic, social order of 1,000 years. And who are you to overthrow an epoch? Pico, we don't care. We don't want your help. We want your fingers out of that drawer because there's too much at stake.
May I have a comment? What I hear is here the keyword is a balance. It seems like, borrowing Nietzschean words, instead of, if you just fight and find out more truth, it seems like it's being lion instead of, wise old men, so to speak. So lion is powerful, facts are powerful, but the wisdom to me, it sounds like, from what I hear, that is being able to balance it. That's what it sounds like, that what is appropriate at that specific time, because time change all the time. So it seems like, the good old word that never changes. It is a balance. It seems like the balance ingredients change all the time, but the wisdom balance, to me, seems like that's the core of it. I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly or not, but it seems like it's not about the finger that's pointing certain things, but it's about knowing that method so that you can actually apply it in your own situation, which is changing all the time.
Right. Yeah. So we got a line of people who've been waiting to talk patiently while I've been going on, but let me kind of weave what you said into the discussion a little bit before we do. And that's as follows. Heraclitus would say, what we're striving for is not so much balance, but a related idea, which is harmony. We're trying to align ourselves with the deeper logic of the cosmos. And if Heraclitus was able to move forward in time and bring his ancient perspective with him and then turn around and look back on the past 2,500 years that followed after he died, he would have said what we see happening over and over is that even though for sustainability and wisdom, civilizations ought to be seeking that harmony, and they often claim that they are, when we look more deeply, what we find is that these civilizations have been launched with conflicts of interest in place, such that there's certain kinds of changes that would be required to achieve harmony that they cannot allow to happen because somebody will lose money or power or authority. And that's more important to those people than whether or not the civilization is in harmony with the cosmos. And as a result of that, time after time, the promise of these epochs is betrayed by the epoch itself, by the things it was not willing to question, by the harmonies it was not willing to allow to overrule its own power structures. And if it could have done that, if it could have recognized that even though there's a conflict of interest, those interested parties need to sacrifice for the long-term good of creating a civilization capable of that, then those civilizations would have lasted longer than they did. Ultimately, in each case, these epochs reach a breaking point where they have too much control, too much power, they're too successful, they're too able to suppress dissent. And because of that, they create the crisis between the increasing mismatch between themselves and what they ought to be like to harmonize with nature. And that always leads to the collapse and the fall. Phil, then Stephen, then James, then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this is interesting. I must say that I'm not certainly yet a Hegelian scholar, but it seems to me Hegel addressed this issue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me like traditional way of thinking is that the intellect was the top dog,
right,
and spirit was an expression of the intellect in the proper way. I think he turned it upside down by saying that intellect is an instrument of spirit, what he called Geist, right? And in some sense, and he put a kind of a safety net in Geist because that's a personal expression of spirit. And he, to put it in a kind of marketing term, he created an index fund, which is called the Zeitgeist.
right.
The collection, the basket of individual spirit that sums up a total expression of a culture. And that safety net, according until the housing bubble blew up, is supposed to leave you some kind of insurance from, let's say, any particular spirit going off the rails and bringing us down, okay?
Yes.
But there seems to me like two different ways you could look at Hegel, even in this thing. One is the more conservative way, is that this Geist, although it creates an evolution, is that evolution lead to a kind of teleology? In other words, that synthesis and so forth that eventually lead to the ultimate flowering and the utopian vision of whatever it is, even though you're caught in the middle of that evolution? Or does it simply just live in the transformation that continues and continues, and there's not really a teleology, but the immediate, which is what Sharon asked, and that it's sort of like the forever wanderer, at which, and you have to, and each epoch or each spirit is replaced by another spirit as it goes on. And since there's not really a teleology as such, at least a long-term teleology, there might be a short-term teleology, then in a sense, you too will be thrown in the dustbin of history in terms of your ideas, which then leads to, I think it leads to Nietzsche and Heidegger, which is that perhaps time is not a real measure of human existence, is that we as beings live in temporality. We live within the short teleology of our existence that we can't, because we have no control, or at least beyond maybe a couple generations at the most, about what the destiny truly will be. And so therefore you have to, in a sense, be satisfied with that you did, I guess, you lived the authentic life, you did the best you could under the circumstances. That's what all beings do, because we do not have, we do not have the bud, the flower, and whatever, the seed, the bud, and the flower, because even that is a short teleology that repeats itself. I just wonder, do we have to readjust ourselves to this sort of like short term, maybe I could call it medium term. A short term is a little medium term sort of forelook in terms of what we are. Because I used to, when I was young, I used to love to drive at night because I have headlights that allow me to look a little bit ahead. And what was far in the distance, I would say in the medium term, certainly in the long term, was a mystery that keeps unfolding itself. Right. And I actually love that, right? Because it was at daytime, I could see miles ahead, and it's like, okay, like I could fall asleep now and put automatic drive and so forth. And so in some sense, it almost seems like as I get older, I'm a little bit more apprehensive because I can't see as well, even in short distances. So I'm not enjoying the long drives in the night as much. I just wonder, like LeBron James says, is this a young man's game?
No, it's not.
So, you bring up the zeitgeist, and one way to think about this is that, the zeitgeist, we talk about it being the spirit of the time, but we might think about it as being the spirit of the epoch.
Okay.
And, the power that the zeitgeist has over us, that it has over our powers of perception and reason, are something that rationalists underestimate. That's why Hegel brought it up so much. He was using this as a corrective against Kant and saying, well, we might like to imagine that we are perfect wills and intellects who can think our way through any problem. That's certainly a modernist perspective. But in truth, our actual character, our actual intellect have been enormously formatted before we can even start thinking about the fact we have a will or an intellect. And that formatting warps everything we look at. It turns our mind into a Procrustean bed that insists that all of the evidence before us be changed to fit our preconceptions. And one way to think about that is that Homo sapiens is an animal that evolved this, as far as we can tell, unique quality in which we have some instincts, but we have far fewer instincts than most of the animals do. What we have in their place is this burning craving to fill the missing spot. We have this drive for culture. We have this need to learn and to pattern ourselves on something. This is like Sharon talked earlier about being drawn out of ourselves, being drawn upward. What is it within us, that longs for something, and that longing appears to go right down to our core biology. So this can work for us and against us. It can work for us to the extent to which we can, like Heraclitus advises us to do, learn to see beyond the surfaces of things to the hidden harmony of the principles that make up the cosmos. He says, when we can do that, then we discover true wisdom. Our minds and our characters and our personalities adapt. That drive to adapt adapts us to our actual circumstances, so that we're beautifully fitted, in Darwinian terms, beautifully adapted, right, to our situation, fit. The problem is that desire to fill the void, as Kenneth Smith warns us, is just as happy filling it with falsehoods as it is with filling it with the truth. Any compelling pattern will do. We're not a finished animal that has evolved to the point where we are naturally drawn to the things that are good for us. We are just as likely to be drawn to the things that are just the worst for us. And so the particular challenge in a Hegelian sense that we face is that craving in us, which is designed to draw us into harmony with reality, what we might call the spirit of nature, the Naturgeist, is just as likely to be satisfied with the Zeitgeist instead. So that the Geist of the epoch, instead of the Geist of nature, draws us in its direction. And we find ourselves adapting to artificial human constructs that may or may not be adaptive, instead of to the things in nature that would make us the most adaptive to be drawn to. And we can't tell the difference, because that longing is pre-rational. It goes all the way down into the structure of the brain. And more importantly, to get at a Nietzschean / Smithian idea, nature made no effort to endear itself to us. The deep principles they hide from us. Heraclitus says nature loves to hide. If you just look at the surfaces of things, you can't see where it all came from. There's like these deeper principles, this hidden harmony that's hard to ferret out. And when we find it has not been designed to please us. It might please us, it might not please us, but at any rate, it seems indifferent to whether we like it or not. Whereas the Zeitgeist has been shaped by other human beings in order to draw people together. And in order to do that, it has been made as appealing as possible. It makes sense to us in a way that nature doesn't make sense to us. It ingratiates itself to us in a way that nature doesn't ingratiate itself to us. It has been very carefully constructed to draw us with the maximal magnetic gravitic power to want to align ourselves with the Zeitgeist instead of with the Naturgeist. And this is the most difficult thing for human beings. That we are drawn away from the thing that Heraclitus says we ought to be orienting towards. And we're drawn towards this ersatz substitute of the Zeitgeist.
So may I just interrupt here? Because I want to ask, so what is Pico saying here? He says, but man was this is the middle of the second paragraph on the modern. He says, but man was by design formed to be irresolute, not determinate, but merely determinable. He is sheerly potential being, an isometric creature in whom there's no natural or spiritual bias in any specific direction. He is microcosmic or omnipotential, according to Pico, containing all the seeds of possibility that other animals possess. So how
let's
does
talk about
that fit into what you're saying there? That just confused me a little bit.
Sure. So Pico, what we've just described is a Hegelian Heraclitean analysis of the relationship of nature and culture to a human being. Pico didn't have any of that. Pico hadn't discovered Heraclitus, and Hegel wasn't going to write for centuries. So Pico is not an existentialist. He doesn't believe the truth comes from nature. He believes it comes from reason and from God. So he is a Neoplatonist who thinks that there are these eternal truths out there, and our job is to reason our way to them. And one way we can reason our way to them is he's emulating. Plato had good stuff and bad stuff. And Plato's good stuff involves drawing off of this great repository of wisdom of previous philosophers and trying to explain them more clearly than they've ever been explained before. Some of the bad stuff in Plato comes from his astounding rhetoric, his ability to persuade you with how good his myth is. And Pico reads Plato and says, well, I could be a mythicist too. I'm going to make my own myth. And that myth is going to justify what I wanted to do anyway. which is to arrive at the truth rationally as an escapist. He doesn't know he's an escapist, but as an escapist rather than as an existentialist. So I'm actually surprised that in this section, Kenneth didn't actually tell you what the myth was, because Kenneth loves myths.
So this is time limited then. This is what you're saying here.
Well, let me tell you the myth,
Okay.
because it's in his oration on the dignity of man, and it's about these angels, among other things. And it says God made a perfect universe because God is all good, God is all knowing, God is all powerful, and God is perfect. So he made a perfect cosmos. Nature makes sense. Every animal knows what it is supposed to be. There's a reason why cattle act like cattle. You don't see cattle hop up on their hind legs and start manufacturing guns and shooting each other. God knew better than that. God made cattle the right way. Cattle are good at what they do. Cats are good at what they do. Trees are good at what they do. And he did that all the way from what he could, he saw a hierarchical universe that went from the lowest worm to the highest angel that God had created. And that included these orders of the angels, right? These 9 orders are up above all of the animals. There's like a line drawn, right? It's like animals are good as far as they go, but genuine spiritual goodness happens above the line with these 9 categories of angels, which Pico did not discover in nature and didn't look for. He was just taught this and then rationalized it, right? As a rationalist, he can make sense out of whatever he's been taught so that it's appealing to him and to others and make it make sense. That's what a rationalist does. So he does that. He says, I adopt this framework of the angels that is the medieval orthodoxy, or has become the medieval orthodoxy, and I'm creating this cosmology and this hierarchy of nature. And God's all good, so he made all this and he made it the right way. And then he says, so how do you fit man into this framework? Because remember, according to the medieval theology, and especially the salvation soteriology, man has to have free will. It's the only way to justify sending some people to eternal reward and other people to eternal torment. It's the only way. God's all good. It's not his fault if we choose to do the wrong thing. He's given us everything we need to choose the right thing. So this is central to the cosmology. But then why would God even do that? Why wouldn't God just make another animal or angel that was perfectly what it was supposed to be and knew what it should do? Pico has put his finger on one of the Achilles heels of the medieval cosmology, because nobody ever had a good answer to this. They've had bad answers. They've really, some theologians have labored at great length to supply an answer, but they all suck. You can go read them for yourself. None of them is persuasive. You have to really be committed to the dogma in advance in order to be persuaded by the previous arguments. And Pico says, as a true child of the medieval world, as an enfant terrible who wants to make it work, he has come up with a solution in exactly that way that the church hierarchy despises. He's putting a spotlight right on the weakest spot of the cosmology, which they can't stand, and then thinking that he's helping by giving you an explanation, which he just invented rationally. And the explanation is this. If you were God and you had free will because you're God, and you made a whole cosmos of things that don't have free will, they all just do what they're supposed to do, that would be lonely. You're the only one of your kind. Wouldn't you get lonely? Pico says, I would get lonely. So I think God would get lonely. I think God did get lonely. And God made another creature with free will, the only creature with free will, so that he'd have somebody to talk to who wouldn't always say the same boring, predictable things that they say because it's their nature to say those things. So what he's done is he's taken an overly deterministic view of the ancient view of free will, right? That all these animals are what they are, and these angels are what they are by their character, and they're stuck with it. And then he's created an overly free human being, which again, the medieval epoch sort of demanded of him. He had to in order to not be a heretic. So we have infinitely free will. We could choose anything. And therefore, we're free to choose goodness in God. And now he's come up with an explanation for why God did it. And so he says the consequence of creating the first animal with free will is that people have the ability to imitate any animal or any angel. We could be like worms. Ask any kid to imitate a worm. They can do it. Ask them to imitate a dog. They can do it. We all have this capacity for mimesis. He says, and that's important to us because it means we also have the capacity to imitate the angels. We can choose to be good, and we have the examples of the angels to guide us. There's really nothing stopping us from approaching, being like God. And then, being Pico, he couldn't stop with that. He had to say, and furthermore, philosophers are the preeminent example of human beings who are properly using their free will because they choose to be like the three highest orders of the angels. They pursue love, they pursue truth, and they pursue justice. That's what it is to be a philosopher. And hey, what a coincidence. I'm a philosopher. Really, I could be like the angels. This is why he's built this whole thing, is in order to, be, he sort of sees and doesn't see what he's doing at the same time, but he's like, hey, I'm like one of the angels. I'm like Aristotle and Plato and Maimonides and all these great people. We're all like floating up there just under God. And isn't this great? And this is what we should be doing. And this is what God wanted us to choose to do. So this is the framework within which he postulates that a human being has and this infinite potential. He said it's because God got lonely and wanted people to choose to be good, not to be good because they were designed that way, the angels. He wanted someone to choose like he chose. Now, he doesn't get into the whole question of, is it worth it to God? Is it worth it to God if millions and millions of people are damned to eternal damnation because they made the wrong choice in order to have someone to talk to? It doesn't actually bear scrutiny. It's kind of pretty, and it kind of emotionally appeals a bit as long as you don't look too hard at it. And let me tell you, the church hierarchy took a long, hard look at this and we're like, nope, we don't need you inventing more theology to try to plug the holes in our cosmology. And frankly, we'd wish you'd shut up about the holes in our cosmology. You're really causing more problems than you're solving. And they, by the way, were right about that. Because many people after Pico were going to go back to that same question and go, yeah, what about that? Why did that? How do we justify this? How does this work? So that's the myth. That's the myth that Pico tells in this oration. He invents a version of the creation story, and in doing so, he's imitating Plato, who created, in his writings, created a version of the creation story of how people came about and what our role is, and the demiurge and all that.
I see.
He's imitating the sincerest form of flattery. He's imitating his idol. Stephen, then James, then Donald, then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
One thing I've been looking at for years, I'm involved in the Melbourne philosophical scene. David Miller, who you've met, has been a big character in that since the 1950s.
Wow, nice.
And you got this little gang of people who think they're smart, and some people roll in and some people roll out. But I went to the meetings, and the bend I've seen, particularly in the last 10 years, is these little gangs of intellectuals can no longer tolerate anybody who goes against their understanding of the cosmos. And David Miller's noticed this. He says, emotionally, these people cannot handle uncertainty. I mean, uncertainty gives me a headache, but I have to live with it.
Likewise.
And you're seeing the drift, particularly in the last 10 years, where these people are going, people are denying climate change, the orthodoxy. People are denying, we've got flat earthers. Now they're anti-vaxxers. They don't actually debate what the anti-vaxxers are going on about, just that you are a heretic against the orthodoxy. What I've noticed, though, is the motivation is very material. Their belief that once they've created the technocratic dictatorship, they will be on top. They will be the rulers, and everybody else will be subjected beneath them. And this is the emotion I've noticed, that there's a very material element in these people that regard themselves as the orthodox. Their grand vision, And this was Hitler too. Hitler was one of these people that had a grand vision of how the world should be. And he will not spare the humans that he will assassinate to get there, whether they're Germans or anybody else. And this worries me. This is a question. We all have a grand vision of how the world should be. And yeah, this is a worrying trend that now we have these people that regard themselves as very rigid technocrats. And some of them are pretty smart, but they have, I've noted this with David. I said, look, they've got a very naive view of philosophy.
Yes.
That there is a simple one unitary understanding that the steam that's inside my head is the same steam that's in the head of an ape. And of course, Jung is a person which points to a possible fallacy here. He says, if you really want to delve into intelligence, you're going into a mad hall of mirrors. You will not come out sane unless you're particularly strong. But yeah, it's amazing that you get all these people who've got these doctorates and everything, and they're proposing a hierarchy where the technocrats are at the top.
Yes.
Just like the medieval church, just like ancient
Yes.
Babylon.
Yes. We carried it forward without realizing we were doing it.
They want to shoot all the heretics.
Yeah.
Or lock them away or something like that. And yeah, this is just cropping up now, particularly now, you know. But I was brought up, I was born in the era of, you know, when Charles Fort was still popular, you know, the Book of the Damned, everything that won't fit. But now I'm quite surprised that the mass of power that wants to suppress anything that cares to differ. Where are we going with this?
Well, it's what's so interesting is that, you know, that desire to establish an orthodoxy in theory goes against the core value that modernism said was its promise. We are going to liberate you from medieval orthodoxy so that you will be free to explore God and nature and politics yourself, right? This is, Pico isn't fully saying all of these things, but you can start to see it in Pico. And certainly you can read it in a lot of constitutions and declarations of independence. But the problem is that pragmatism and inalienable freedom and inalienable free will and all of these other things are profoundly anti-philosophical concepts. They all claim by fiat to be delivering the thing that the ancients said was incredibly hard to achieve. And for the ancients, the question was, how can we wrestle with the impediments in order to achieve these difficult things, like being able to be wise or being able to be free? And the modern era says, what impediments? Voila, you are free, I free you. And it becomes a kind of an empty freedom that it is literally the proper definition of begging the question, because rather than answering the question of saying, well, how can we achieve freedom? It just begs it by saying, you've achieved it, don't ask. I claim that you have it, and therefore we don't have to talk about what it is. So the problem is we build in this deep anti-philosophical bias. We propose that the most difficult things in life are actually the easiest things in life. You get them out of the starting gate when you're bored. And by doing that, we encourage people not to know themselves, not to figure out what makes a human being tick. And among the things that we don't notice is we don't notice the incredibly powerful and subversive role of hubris. Moderns are in some ways the most hubristic epoch that we know of, because we believe we are the most objective and therefore have transcended our hubris. We believe automatically we're free from hubris because that's a kind of freedom. So it means that when people engage in totalitarian activities, when they find themselves wanting to stamp out heresy, when they find themselves doing these things that they should be questioning, that they should be correcting in themselves, that it shouldn't be possible for them to do it without immediately responding and going, whoa, did I say that? I'm so sorry. I can't believe that came out of my mouth. Instead, they don't ask. They don't wonder. They don't critique themselves because they know in their heart of hearts they're already good and they're already free and they already believe in everybody else's freedom because they said so. Nothing to see, nothing to ask, nothing to explore. That kind of mindset doesn't allow room for self-criticism and humility. It drives it out. And so this is how you get people doing the exact opposite of what they ostensibly stand for, because noticing the difference would require a level of insight and introspection that is counter-modern, that we don't teach people to do. It's a theme we'll come back to. That what you're talking about is going to come up over and over in this book. James, then Donald, then Phil. Go ahead, James. Oh, are you there, James? Did we lose you? Are you muted? We're not hearing you. All right, we'll come back to you, James. Donald, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that wisdom, somewhat like courage, is not about that everything is not about knowing or
Right.
knowing and everything being knowable, which is itself may not be true. It's more about what we do when we don't know, how we
Right.
act.
Right.
Always, yeah. Same like courage. If the future was not opaque, we wouldn't even need these things as human virtues. We would
Exactly.
simply do the right thing.
Right.
Human virtues are focus on acting in the absence of knowledge as much as, I mean, that's one of their characteristics. It may not be in each case the defining characteristic, but so there's an old thing in the Greeks that I think they say truth, but it could be wisdom or whatever, is a harmony between thinking and being. It's moderns who have made truth a property of statements,
Right.
which leads to, well, it leads to all the problems that Gödel exposed for certain. So, and just to say to Stephen, we continue killing our way to a better world.
Correct. Yes, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. How do you
It's
Sadly.
not even original with me. It was off a schlocky TV show, but one character. I was surprised they said such truth.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
well, that's why we need war. It helps bring about that better world by
That's right.
increasing the rate of killing.
God help us. Yeah, you know, the role of virtue is in what you're describing is something that Hegel and Heraclitus and the pre-Socratic Greeks really delve into, which is it's required because of our mortality, because of our finitude, because we don't know what the right thing is to do. We need help arriving at the right conclusion. And if we believe that we can just always successfully think our way to the right conclusion on the spur of the moment, like all those Grimm's fairy tale Jack the Giant Killer, Jack and, you know, all those clever Hans characters. Yeah, I may not know much, but with no preparation whatsoever, I can just think. And by thinking, I will arrive at the right conclusion because I'm clever. This is a mistaken view of the human intellect, but it is core to the concept of a rationalist or an intellectualist. They think they can think their way to the truth because it pleases them to think so. They have no empirical evidence that proves that that's true, right? We think our way to falsehoods as often as we think our way to the truth. Even when we deploy logic and all the other tools at our disposal, as long as we stay in this domain, we're out of sync with this domain. We have to put this domain and this domain together to leash this domain if we want our thinking to get us somewhere. So there is this bounty, this bonus of the unknown that is a result of being finite mortal creatures that requires that we put as many prosthetic aids on our thinking as we can. And in the Greek concept, the ancient Greek conception, virtues are the core of those prostheses that we need. The purpose of saying that I'm going to be honest and candid with people and that I'm going to pursue the truth is that as long as I hold that before me as a frame of reference, then as I'm reasoning, I'm more likely to notice when I'm not true to it. Likewise, courage. If I always hold up courage as a frame of reference, then I'm more likely to notice when my thinking and behavior are not aligned with courage. All of these virtues are there to help steer us away from disasters, to help frame in our behavior and our thinking. And without them, if we think, oh, we don't need any of that traditional stuff, we'll just reason our way forward, we become more like those blind jellyfish again, not really knowing where we're going or why, and just kind of trying to rationalize it afterwards. Sharon, you threw your hand up.
So here's a modern thought or modern saying that manliness is confidence in the face of risk.
Right.
That requires no thought. It's just purely action.
Yes.
And probably because I've lived with surgeons my whole life, I saw that many times.
Oh, yeah.
When there was extreme uncertainty and therefore extreme opacity, the more confident you got.
Right. I'm holding the solution to all my problems in my hand. It's a scalpel.
Total hubris.
When in doubt, cut, right? Like, why have I been given this scalpel if not to cut? It's why I'm here in the world.
Total hubris.
Yes. And so this is the challenge for us. The reason to belabor this is that all escapist philosophies or ideologies, the core vice in all of them is a lack of humility.
Mm-hmm.
The belief that we can impose our little system of philosophy onto the world and history, and it will obey our will and fit within the lines we've drawn for it, is an act of tremendous hubris. It is an unconscious aping of what an all-powerful, all-good God could do, except that we're not all-powerful or all-good or all-knowing, which means when we try to do it, we're imposing our mistakes on everything, right? We can't emulate the act of creation and categorization that the medieval God can do, but that doesn't stop us from trying over and over and creating blunders. So our challenge is that an authentic spirituality, an authentic religion has to have an enormous freight of humility and say, it is not up to us to dictate terms to nature. And in the same breath, it's not up to us to dictate terms to God. We don't get to define the divine. We have to discover the divine and explore the divine the same way that we have to explore easier things that are more at hand. And as long as we have that attitude towards the sacred, there's some chance we could actually explore the sacred. But the moment that we fall into dogma and start thinking, oh no, I have the godlike power to define God, and I will say what God is and what God is not, then we have become ego monsters of the highest order. And we become, even if we have every other virtue in the book, as Aristotle warned us, the absence of the one virtue will turn all the others into vices and turn our story arc into a tragedy. And so, again, not a coincidence that the medieval revolution, which promised an end to hubris, to the ancient corruption, by becoming subservient to God, ends with the exact opposite, and the medieval church itself becoming the center of corruption. It's the necessary tragic arc of not recognizing the hubris that was built into the framework from the get-go. If you want to be spiritual, you can't do it in an arrogant way, or else you're going to ruin everything. So, Phil, you got your hand up, and then we'll go back to Pico.
Yeah. Thank you for telling us the myth of Pico, because that led me to a thought that was interesting. And I want to change that myth slightly.
Yeah.
That God was not lonely. He wanted to see a reflection of himself, what free will was on. So he created man, but the reflection, unfortunately, was a funhouse mirror that distorted reflection slightly. But that will help me understand, in a sense, Shakespeare better.
Yeah.
Because it talked about, the play is a thing.
Yes.
Not the original. The reflection of the thing is the thing that will give you the thing. It would talk about how exposing the psychology, which is a deeper reflection in our interiority, became so prominent, okay? Whether it's through the play of Hamlet, of Shakespeare, particularly through Hamlet, because it makes it so manifest, he's going to wait till the play.
Yeah.
Or through Jung, it seems to me this reflection into interiority then became something that exposes something that Oedipus did not see,
Right.
but in fact was there. So it becomes a kind of a double mirror. And to me, it seems like, okay, the word reflection is interesting. You could either be like Narcissus, to look at the reflection and you see the surfaces of things and the beauty of things. Or you can see reflection as deep thinking, which is, I suppose, a road to wisdom, which is also a reflection of the interior,
Right.
relationship to the exterior. I think that duality is kind of interesting because they're both reflections with very different meanings. But it is, in both cases, a second order remove from the thing itself, right?
Right.
Which obviously human beings live in. We do not live directly in the thing. We have to reflect on the thing and then we appropriate it into interiority.
Yes.
And then we reflect it back to nature in that sense to check to see if, if this is a fun house mirror or whether it matches the thing itself. I think this becomes a kind of problem, a complexity that many people are not capable of dealing with, but in fact, it is the reality.
Right.
That I think maybe Heraclitus has a grasp of, but is not expressed in a direct way like Shakespeare does.
Right.
And so, at least we got a clue about our existence in the world because it has to relate to this double mirror, so to speak, reflecting the exterior and then reflecting it back.
Yes.
So that we could have an appropriate relationship to empiricism and to see, and looking around, well, okay, that sort of, it's not parallax, it seemed to be in alignment.
Right.
I think that's part of the problem is we get carried away now with too much with the interiority, maybe too much with just the mirroring, like the hall of mirrors. And so you get lost in it. So now you no longer are dealing with the exterior, but you're just dealing with all those interiors. I think this is the problem. And I think if we could get people into, in a sense, at least, looking back and just not looking at the mirror all the time, maybe we would, in a sense, have some integration, because I think it's that relationship between the interior and the exterior that
Yes.
becomes a thing, you know?
Yes.
So thank you for that thing. Like I said, I like the change that God had made the mistake by creating the fun house reflection, and that we are looking at the hard mirrors.
Well, and this is, what you're exploring there is that Pico, as a escapist intellectual, he was trying to patch up the orthodoxy. And as soon as it was patched to his own satisfaction, as soon as it pleases him, right? It's placita, a thing that pleases, then he considered it done. And what we see in this is the great hazard of intellectualism, is what persuades us. When does the logic of an argument persuade us? And what's shocking is how often it's not even, certainly how often it's not true, right? Because logic and truth are orthogonal to each other. But how often it's not even logically valid, because we stopped before we rigorously established the logic of it. We stopped the moment that it pleased us. As soon as we got the pleasure response internally that said, this is nice, I like this, then we stop looking, even if we haven't finished our logic. So what Pico's doing here is he's taking something that was unfinished by the medieval orthodoxy, and he's patching it with something else that's unfinished. And he, because it pleases him, he can't scrutinize his own idea with the level of detail that he was able to scrutinize the orthodox idea. And if he had been able to, he would have seen that his solution suggests all kinds of new problems, like you're talking about. Like, could God feel, if God created free will and was willing to doom millions of people to eternal torture in order to have somebody to talk to who he felt was like himself, as Pico asserts, would God have been satisfied with as bad an imitation of God as we are? Because he's got all goodness and all power and all knowledge. And what do we have? We are frequently not good. Our powers are limited, and we're woefully ignorant, and yet at the same time full of ourselves. Would God feel like an animal who had free will but had none of these other virtues was close enough to give him the companionship that this lonely God evidently craved? And Pico doesn't want to go there. He just doesn't look at that question.
Well, God does have the problem of the Kung Fu master, right? You teach your pupil, but you don't teach him the ultimate weapon, just
Pico's
in case
God.
he gets uppity, right? So you don't want to create Lucifer with equal powers because he will dethrone you, but nonetheless, you create something that's very close, but has his one flaws, just in case the lieutenant wanted to rebel. You will hold the ultimate, right? So you're gonna have to create a slight funhouse mirror to detract him. So I mean, the Kung Fu master, in some sense, in order to stay in the prominent place, have to distort it ever so slightly, even though he wants to look at himself.
Right.
So in some.
So, what you have here is, the medieval theology has the problem that it has rightly figured out that if human beings were to submit to the sacred, we would do better in the world than if we just, claim to be better than we are and rule over each other cruelly. But the medieval theology doesn't actually have a very clear idea of what the sacred is or how it works. It's caught up in all these humanizing stories, right? Because remember, along with the Gospels and epistles that made it into the canon, there was that enormous variety that got cut out. And part of the reason why they were cut out is that they had an even greater bounty of invention. People just made up stories about what Jesus did when he was a little boy. They didn't know, but they wanted to know. And they felt like it would be a more satisfying theology if there was an answer. So they just willfully, creatively made an answer, not based on what Jesus actually did, but on what they felt like it would be cool if Jesus did. And then here are the church fathers trying to make a canon later on going, of these books, how much of this is this kind of willful creativity and how much of it is the authentic Jesus? And their answer is, we're not sure, right? They're bringing in an imperfect capturing of Jesus's teachings, and they know that's what they're doing. And yet, once the medieval hierarchy is launched, it won't allow this imperfect creation to be questioned. Even though the people who made the canon knew that this was only an approximation of the sacred, and that if we really wanted to approach the sacred, we really had a duty to explore and be willing to admit the imperfection of our representation of it. Nevertheless, it gets turned into an orthodoxy. And so we build in this hubris and humility at the same time. This is why we say that an epoch can't be characterized as just one virtue or just one vice. It's always pairs. It's always a spectrum of wrestling back and forth. And so in the medieval epoch, the humility of submitting to God goes hand in hand with the hubris of pretending that our description of God isn't deeply flawed, and enforcing on everybody that they behave in accordance with this kind of broken version that we have, instead of saying, let's all be spiritual and try to be good people. They're all saying, instead, do exactly this thing that I've written down. Well, somebody wrote down, actually, I'm not sure who wrote it down and how much of it is really what Jesus said and how much is what some 2nd century guy having an argument with his neighbor said. And, we don't know which is which, but we're not willing to admit that we're human and fallible. And so we bake in this problem. So this sets in 1,000 years of intellectualism. This is not how people usually describe the Dark Age, but that's because moderns call it the Dark Age when they shouldn't. This is an era that becomes typified by intellectualism, rationality, reasoning from first principles that have been established for us to conclusions that have been established for us, but reason. So it's not a surprise that what we see Pico doing when he tries to fix the problems is not to say, I wonder what's true, but to say, I wonder how I can fix this thing that pleases me, but has this displeasing part over here, so that it pleases me as a whole. This is the way in which, to a Benausos, the purpose of noesis is to turn back in on itself and make a self-consistent whole picture that doesn't seem to be missing anything. How to create the illusion that Gödel disrupted later by proving that all such illusions, can't represent the full world outside. Doesn't want to admit the extent of the problem. He's hoping that if he can just cover it up and patch it up, everything will be fine. So I'd like to compare that. I mean, where this becomes, where Kenneth Smith's description of human characterology that he draws out of this existential tradition fits with Pico and the launch of modernism is particularly interesting, because in his act of freely inventing theology, he is trying to create a better orthodoxy. A better orthodoxy leaves less room for freedom than an inferior orthodoxy. The more obviously broken an orthodoxy is, the more people are driven to creatively explore the world, because they can see this can't be everything. This might have good things that they like, but it's got all these problems anybody can see. And it leads people outward, right? To create, to explore, to try to learn. But if you could perfect the orthodoxy and make it seem like it had no flaws, it would shut down people's creative faculties and give them less room for freedom. So ironically, what Pico's doing in trying to create a better system, a better explanation, is, he's shutting down the room for free exploration that he himself is wielding in order to shut down that room for exploration. Do you see what I mean by that? He's trying to make the orthodoxy work better.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that that's not what we got out of Pico. That's what he got in trouble. He messing with that stuff, criticizing Aquinas, he got in trouble for all that stuff. But what he set in motion as a side effect of doing it was the example rather than the message. And the example was, well, if he can question the orthodoxy and the theology, why can't we question the orthodoxy and theology. And if it's true that human beings are this, or if it's true-ish, truthiness, right? If it's true-ish that human beings have this potential to go in any direction, maybe we should explore those directions. Maybe we shouldn't feel trapped within the orthodoxy. Maybe we should break out. So I think, as with Kant, Pico set in motion things he didn't entirely intend. And he himself, his own ideas contained enough internal contradictions that he didn't fully understand what he intended. So
should he have been assassinated?
And then he's assassinated. Yeah, along with his lover. Yeah. Yeah, this is one of those turning points, because the assassinations begin to mount up. The inquisitions begin to mount up. The witch hunts begin to mount up. As a result of this, there are things that you're not supposed to question, but he questioned them confidently and openly in front of all of the European intellectuals and said, let us all question this together. And, you know, the church, by which we mean the medieval hierarchy, was horrified. And basically, at that point, they could see that they had let things go too far. And if they didn't rein this in, they were going to lose control over everything. And they were right, they did. That's exactly what happened. All right, so far so good. So one thing about this that I think is important to take away is that idea that empiricism might be useful, but it's not the cool part. The cool part is that you're a Renaissance man, you're a genius, you're a smarty pants who can think his way to the truth. Maybe empiricism is a useful tool. Maybe we notice it, maybe we don't. But the important part is, look how smart these guys are, and I want to be a smart guy along with them. If that's your goal, to join the pantheon, how open are you going to be to poking holes in the pantheon? Are you really going to want to see the flaws in Parmenides and Plato and Aristotle if you admire them and virtually worship them and want to become one of them? If you want people centuries from now to list you with them, do you want their star to fall? Because if that's your company, then your star falls too. So there's a way in which his love of these guys also prevents him from being able to critique them the way that some of his own heroes like Avicenna are critiquing them. Again, there's a reason why he can't see the importance of empiricism here. It flies in the face of what he's trying to do. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was. Sorry, I've forgotten it.
That's okay. It'll come back. All right. So going back to the text, right? What is Pico then? He's not a doulos. He has an inquisitive mind. He's hungry for knowledge. He's a polymath. He's reading everything he can, right? He's clearly not a doulos. Is he a banausos? Well, certainly he's an intellectual, and that gives him a strong banausic character. He's very focused on reason and rationality and systematization. In fact, he wants to become a great systematizer. So he has profound noetic drives. There's no question that the academic upbringing he had really prepared him for a banausic role. But the thing is, a real banausos would be perfectly willing to be insulated from reality to a greater extent. The particular kind of banauseia that grew up within the academic tradition of the universities leading into the Renaissance is one of going beyond the system. The system that medievalism provided, they promised would cover all the ground. You don't need to inquire anywhere outside of this. In fact, if you do, we'll burn you. So stay in here, inquire to your heart's content, but don't go for any principles before the ones that we have postulated, and don't reach any conclusions other than ones that we told you are the acceptable ones. You can reason within that frame. But that's not what these guys are doing. He's collecting Maimonides, he's collecting Avicenna, he's collecting, all of these different creators, and he's trying to extend the system to embrace them. that is a mix of gnosis and noesis. You see what I'm trying to say here? He is not satisfied mastering the system he's been given. He wants to grow the system by adding things to it. This is the kind of thing that we see happening in the Library of Alexandria in the Hellenistic era. That kind of, we can seek out all religions and all philosophies and collect them all together and make sense out of them, is a Hellenistic Alexandrian thing to do. It's not classical Greek. He's not at the level of a Plato or Aristotle, let alone a Heraclitus, but he is rising to the level of these librarians and saying, our picture's not complete unless we can account for all of this. I'm not willing to be part of a system that's so constrained. This is when we, remember, we don't, as existentialists, we don't want to fall prey to the law of the excluded middle. We don't want to think that these three character types and personalities that develop from these modes of thinking, we don't want to think that they're tidy little categories with solid lines between them. We need to understand them in a dialectical way, in the way one grows out of the other and becomes another one because of its inherent forces. And likewise, there is a zone between Aristeia and Banauseia in which a there's two different ways to say this. A Banausos raised in an heuristic environment would engage in more heuristic activities than your usual run-of-the-mill Banausos, right? The argument, in fact, this is the core value proposition of the ancient epoch. They say if you put Aristeia, if you put Aristoi in charge, then your Banausoi and Douloi will become better Banausoi and Douloi than they would be if you didn't have Aristoi in charge, because the Aristoi will culture those people. They will teach them as much wisdom as they're able to absorb. Some of them may even develop into the other type, but even if they don't, they'll be pulled upward and the civilization as a whole will be better for it. You'll have a healthier, richer culture with better individuals. So that means that Banauseia isn't a little fenced off area in which all Banausoi behave the same way. It is more like a gravity well or a strange attractor in which there is a bell curve, a wide area of possible expressions of the Banausic impulse within someone. They could express those things in a purely Banausic way. They could express it in more of a Dualic way. They could express it in more of an heuristic way. And what we see Pico doing, in one sense, could be interpreted as a Banausos exposed to all these heuristic authors, yearning to become more and sort of stretching a little bit. There's another way to see it. And the other way to see it is more useful for the modern epoch. In the modern epoch, we've committed characterological genocide to eliminate Aristoi. People who grow up with the heuristic impulses have to fit themselves into the Dualic roles or the Banausic roles because that's all that's allowed within the modern machine. But they don't sit there comfortably because their goals, their internal drive, their internal nature is always rebelling against those constraints. They want to ask questions they're not supposed to ask. They want to make things they're not supposed to make. They want to draw connections they're not supposed to draw. They can't help it. It's their character. As Heraclitus would say, it's the lawfulness of their inner nature that makes them discontented with the shackles that they're being forced into by modernism. So a potential Aristos who was raised in a sufficiently Banausic environment would try to be a Banausos, but would be unable to fully comply and would again reach out into that middle zone and try to do heuristic things. Would be drawn to examples of Aristoi and would keep breaking the rules. I think when you see Pico, I don't know that we could ever determine whether he is an heuristic Banausos or a Banausic Aristos, but I think we can safely say he's neither one nor the other entirely. I don't mean he's in a spectrum in the middle, but whichever thing he is, he's not able to achieve Aristeia. And many of his drives and desires are deeply noetic. His desire to make a great system that's noesis in a nutshell. I can make a system that everything will fit into and it'll be tidy and nice, and won't that be great? And I'm a great person for doing this. That's a very Banausic thing. So this is what I mean. He's sort of standing in this odd position. Phil, and then Stephen, and then I think saw Sharon came off mute, so maybe she'd like to talk too. But
I want to ask a question that I think is probably very simplistic. I
Sure.
like that discussion of yours, but my pragmatic mind asks me, why does that matter?
the question is, who are the revolutionaries?
Okay.
And if you come to think that the revolutionaries can only be Aristoi because Aristoi tend to rock the boat, then it puts us in a position of not understanding why these movements arise the way that they do. Right? He may not have been an Aristos.
Yeah, but that brings me back to one of the things that I observed, that the utterings or the judgments or the perspectives of the philosophers come from their social background.
Yes. Yes. And this is what Hegel and Kenneth Smith say, is that each epoch makes some character types more or less comfortable. It gives more or less roles to each character type. So some of them can be more or less what they naturally want to be, whereas others have to contort themselves to fit within uncomfortable roles. Like,
okay.
He says in the modern epoch, there's widespread depression and substance abuse among Aristoi. And you find a lot of Aristoi in prison because there's no place for them. There's nothing they can find in their life to make them satisfied. And the ones that are satisfied, they tend, ish, who succeed, always tend to be uncomfortable at the same time that they're doing well. It's like they are and they aren't satisfied at the same time, because modernism doesn't want there to be a place for Aristoi. It doesn't want any Aristoi. So partially this gets to understanding the epoch and what happens to a person within the epoch.
Okay.
So what happens to Pico? Whether he's an Aristos or not, he tries to do an eristic thing and he gets killed for it. First he's condemned as a heretic, and then he's murdered. That's the position that the medieval world had for somebody who tried to openly do something eristic. In the medieval world, you had enormous freedom to do eristic things privately, right? Because the hierarchy didn't have that level of control that we have nowadays. But you couldn't do it publicly. If you did it publicly, then you were challenging the hierarchy and they'd take you down.
And so the hierarchy was primarily?
There's the church and state.
Yes, but
So
was
you've got
primarily what character type?
Banausoi.
Banausoi, okay.
Because there's systems and rules, there's logic, there's power structures to climb. Banausoi love that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
And what's interesting is, to this day, we don't know who assassinated Pico. There's arguments. We know that the church was angry with him, right? He was his 900 Theses was banned and burned, but the church didn't lock him up. They didn't pull a Galileo on him. And it's possible that he was killed not by the religious hierarchy, but by the secular hierarchy, by one of the Medicis. But we don't know. We don't know.
That's the allegation.
Yeah. Maybe next week we could talk a little about the Medicis and what was going on there. But I think for this week that takes us too far afield. We'd have to get into Savonarola, and we will. We should probably talk about Savonarola next week, because he was close friends with Pico della Mirandola, and Savonarola is widely cited as the inspiration for the Reformation. Yes. Martin Luther directly cites him. And he came into conflict with the hierarchies of the church and with the Medicis, and understanding this a little bit more will again help us to understand the ways in which none of this is logical syllogisms. The people who are the movers and shakers in history are never well suited for the roles they're in. And at the same time that they set something good in motion, they also screw some things up badly because of the limitations of their character. There's always a mix of inspiration and tragedy, and sometimes even farce in how these things resolve themselves.
So at the end of this, I want to have a clear understanding in my mind as to why Kenneth Smith chose Pico as the representative of the modern thinking, of the gateway to the modern thinking.
I'll come back to
So
that.
I can see that's a process.
Yes.
And probably my lack of physiological depth is presenting a challenge, but I'm still going to understand it.
Yes, we'll talk about it. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
I wonder, in the current conditions, since everything is so globalized, the monetary system, the economic structure, the control of information is so total. I wonder whether there is really truly room for revolution outside of like outright violence. That becomes a problem. I've been recently thinking a lot about China. Okay, so it's related to this, but in a slightly different way. You know, China has perhaps realized that the world monetary system is not working, at least to its advantage. Okay, they feel trapped in it. And the simple structure of present-day China is that it had 3 stages. There was the Maoist period, which was very socialist, communist, and made many mistakes. Many people died and were killed. Okay, so he was a tyrant in his own right. Maybe he tried to do what's right for China, but he made a lot of blunders. Then there was a period of Deng Xiaoping, who decided to release the energy by engaging in the world system in order to develop trade and develop wealth and the potentialities thereby.
Right.
And now we have the era of Xi Jinping, okay? And he is wanting to decouple from that system by in a sense, thinking that the world monetary system is actually bad for the world and certainly bad for China. And he's bringing the term common prosperity because it has created internal prosperity for China, but has really separated the rich from the poor. Same thing we have, but even more extreme in China. I think they may have passed us in terms of the number of billionaires in China. Not now, because he sort of like nixed them, a lot of them.
For that.
Okay. Now I wonder whether he is doing a good thing, at least for China, because he wants to create a more of an equal relationship between, well, common prosperity between all people. Not necessarily flat, but nonetheless a greater thing. And that sounds good. But is he doing this in a sense because he is actually fearful of losing control of the autocratic relationship that the party has, which is, to me, seems very possible because that seems like the history of China. Okay, so even if you buy the whole argument that he doesn't want to invade other countries, you know, except maybe Taiwan, because that's part of China, the one China policy, whatever. Okay, even if you accept that, I wonder whether he is actually doing a good thing or he just wanted to preserve his own status, you know, the wealth of the people and the corruption of the people and the Communist Party, rather actually redistributing wealth. And so that becomes a very interesting issue that talks about the state of control between liberation and control in the system, which seems to reflect what we're going on.
Right.
At least in Pico's period, the world was not totalized. There was outside information that could flow in, whether through under the cover or whatever it is. But now it seems like doesn't matter where you are, you're still in the world monetary system, you're in one information system. And whether there really truly is enough elbow room for true revolutions to take place outside of a liberal democracy, which of course is being more and more displaced by a kind of monetary control. So I'm just asking the question, right? So we are hoping that this evolution to a ever higher plane of better distribution or better liberation of people would happen. But I'm just wondering whether that is indeed true, because we have, in a sense, intellectually and monetarily, economically, totalized everything. And whether there is small movements in Bangladesh or whatever that can upset the system other than we're in, let alone in the United States. So I'm just sort of asking that question because I think Paco was an important figure, because transitional figures are, even though they didn't know what they were really doing,
right,
they were important in order to move into a different transition. So I think whether there is even a possibility for a transitional figure, we used to hope that technology that will liberate us, information will flow freely and all that, and all that kind of stuff. And there was great optimism in that, but it soon was under the control of these fiefdoms, techno fiefdom, like, Facebook, Amazon, in which, you go in and it controls everything, And so I'm just asking a question. Have we led to finally this liberation does have finally led to a dead end in which the best we could do is struggle for survival, let alone further liberation.
Over the course of this book, we'll be exploring this. And, I think the thing that we can be sure of is that we will never bring the modern epoch as fully into focus as we can the medieval and ancient epochs, because we see their endings and we don't see our own, which means we don't yet know the full shape of our story, which means things that are happening right now that might be centrally important to understanding the modern epoch might be things we're overlooking.
Yeah.
Indeed, the overlooking, you start to see the power of the overlooking in defining the medieval epoch. This is one of the things that Kenneth Smith talks about a lot, that he gets from other existentialist philosophers. He says, what is not examined is often more defining than what is known. Our blind spots drive us and control us in ways that we are by definition blind to. And frequently it's the case that if we weren't blind to them, we might have made different choices. But it's because we never could look at that thing squarely in the face that we could never do anything about it. But we'll do what we can to try to bring the modern epoch into better focus. Stephen, and then I'm going to see if I can tackle Sharon's question to wrap us up.
Okay, yeah. The question is, when we talk about man having free will, or the point in, say, the Islamics will make, and is that there's the jinns or the fallen spirits. So prior to the creation of man, other spirits were created with free will. The problem was, like Lucifer, they looked at God and said, "Hey, dude, move over." This is, we haven't addressed this in saying that man is the only creature that God made that was given free will. In other theologies, this might not be the case. There's this whole line of jinns or fallen spirits who were given it, and what they did was fall.
Right. Yeah, there are ways in which, and this is, what you said leads right into what I wanted to talk about with Sharon. There are ways in which Pico is seeing more widely than most of his contemporaries. He is reading a lot of other philosophers from a lot of different cultures, and trying to make sense of them. He's the fact that he's trying to make a grand system. Okay, that's a Banausic Noetic thing to do. But the fact that he's trying to grapple with them in what he imagines to be from their own point of view. He's not just trying to say, I understand you in order to dismiss you. I understand you in order to scapegoat you. I understand you in order to prove that I'm right. He's not doing that. This is a counter-medieval thing that he's doing, that he's looking beyond the medieval orthodoxy, looking at other things and saying, you can't be a philosopher unless you look beyond and try to let those people speak to you in their authentic voice. Now, he may not be capable of hearing their authentic voice. We're familiar with the challenge, but he's trying, right? And so, here he is looking at these Islamic writers, and they write about what Stephen's talking about, but he doesn't notice that part, right? He's still really captured by the medieval theology. And that's why he proposes the version of man having free will that he does, is because it's consistent with the medieval orthodoxy.
And he was so young, wasn't he? He was killed. I know he died at the age of 31 or 32 or something.
A kid, right? I mean, we all said stupid things.
Could you imagine
20s and
somebody
30s,
with
right?
that kind of a brain, that kind of observation, understanding? That's
you
amazing.
Can't blame him. You're right. You can't blame him for not seeing everything. He really didn't have the decades he needed to fully process what he was being exposed to. But one feels like, given that he's a syncretist, if he had fully absorbed, the Islamic theology and the relationships between the jinns and human beings and God and angels, that he might have come up with a different myth in order to fit it all together. He really did want it to all make sense together. And he did see all of the wise people of all the different traditions as being in some kind of harmony that it was his job to discover. So there's a couple of modernist things here, right? Ecumenicalism. He's looking at multiple religions and seeing validity in all of them. That is a deeply anti-medieval perspective. So there is a way in which the ecumenicalism of modern Christianity owes a debt to Pico. Even if no modern Christian church would buy his particular myth about human beings and their relationship to angels and animals and God, nevertheless, the idea of ecumenicalism, that caught fire. He wasn't the first to say it, but he said it openly and proudly to every intellectual in Europe and said, this should be the basis for our new intellectual life. The second is a rejection of orthodoxy. You would think they go hand in hand, but even though he was trying to patch up orthodoxy, he was also implicitly saying it's not enough. What the medieval promise that this orthodoxy will lead us to God is not true, because we have to look at these other sources. Without these other sources, we're not going to make it. So two sides of the same coin, pro-ecumenicalism, and also while trying to save the orthodoxy, he's also effectively overthrowing the orthodoxy, which is the part the Orthodox really heard, right? You are saying we're not enough. You are saying we're not complete. He is engaging in philosophical debate with Thomas Aquinas and others. He's going after sacred cows, if you will, of the framework of medieval intellectualism, and saying not only is it okay to question them, we have an obligation to question them, even if the conclusion we reach is that they're fundamentally wrong about things that are important to the hierarchy. We should still do it. That was a massive challenge to the power of Orthodox theology. It was going for the Achilles heel. And he had an unerring instinct for the Achilles heel. He may never have got exactly right what he should do about the Achilles heels, but every major flaw in medieval cosmology was something he had something to say about. So he writes all these theses. Now, in writing his 900 Theses, he's partly inspired by Savonarola, who we'll talk about next week, who wrote some theses. And these two together end up inspiring Martin Luther, whose theses nailed to the church door was the sort of nail in the coffin of the medieval era, right? So there is a direct line leading from these guys to Martin Luther.
The Reformation.
Yes. And the Reformation, as a number of writers, including Max Weber, have said, is central to understanding modernism. Protestantism and modernism go hand in hand for reasons that get explored.
I'm just making a wild assumption to a certain degree, but that's the kind of things you do when you're young. You come to conclusions much more quickly.
Yes.
And especially if you have a brilliant brain like Pico, for example.
Yes.
But I think that was part of the reason why he was like that, was because he was so young, and he had such a brilliant brain.
Yeah. That's
and
right.
that was ultimately his downfall, sadly.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Rick.
So I hope that helps some.
Yes, it does help. It helps a lot because because the time period in which he was born was almost the pre-modern period. So I find his observations, I was trying to understand the relevance of his observations to the modern period.
Right.
That's why I asked that.
Well, it illustrates this thing that Hegel says, that the flaw in Kant's thesis, antithesis, synthesis is the idea that the antithesis can come from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
He says maybe that's mechanical order, but that's not organic order. The way organic order works is even the thing in its most perfect form already contains its own arguments that are going to lead to its overthrow, right? Nobody had to come from outside and smash the medieval epoch. The medieval epoch carried the contradictions inside of itself, the multiple competing visions of God, the insistence that everything was at stake and that we had to absolutely get this right, followed by the imposition of a totalitarian orthodoxy that refused to let us inquire as to what was right. That created an impossible contradiction. If everything's at stake in getting it right, but you're not allowed to question, then how do we know we're getting it right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's an intolerable existential position to be in psychologically, and it drove the emergence of heresies. And ultimately, eventually it drove the emergence of a heresy strong enough to break the shackles and end the medieval epoch. And,
but even Martin Luther was ignorant politically in this sense. He thought his thesis would be much more of a smaller group intellectual disagreement.
Well, yes.
But when he nailed it to the wall, he did realize the printing press would be published throughout.
Yes.
Everybody heard about it. And
Yes.
so therefore he couldn't manage to keep it under control. You know what I mean?
Right.
If it was sort of like in a smaller circle, it's a critique and so forth, that might have still worked in relationship to the Catholic Church, but it just broke wide open.
Well, it was the same with Pico. Even though he's a 20-year-old full of himself and very excited, nevertheless, he didn't understand that the church was going to have a major problem with this. He thought we're all in the university culture together. The church started the universities, right? We must all be in agreement that intellectual ferment is just cool. It's what we should be doing. So, he happily invites together people for what he thinks is going to be this fun debate. And next thing he knows, his works are being burned. And, it's like, whoa, who could have foreseen all of this consequence?
Yeah.
But it's because even at the late stage of an epoch, when so many things are clear, still many of the most essential structures of power are not exactly clear to the people to whom they should have been the most clear. The blindness, the nescience, the lacunae in our understanding of the world persist right up until the very end. And it's really not until the next epoch, looking back, that we fully start to bring into focus what the big forces were that everybody was overlooking. Because, we had this, because the success of the previous epoch's worldview works too well at getting its members to hide from themselves what's really at stake. They buy into the framework and thereby fail to see where the framework is flawed. Donald, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Jenny is brought back a bad memory. I think at about the age of 20, one of my professors and I had a little reading thing where we were going through Heidegger's Being and Time. And I wrote a one-page paper answering the question why there's something rather than nothing.
Yes. Yes.
I was sure I had nailed it.
Do you still have it?
No, I think I would have destroyed it quickly.
Because you know I'm going to ask to read
What
it,
grade
right?
did you get? Did he give you an A? Did he give you an A?
Oh, I'm sure he did, but not for that paper. That paper was like Pico, you know. I'm 20.
Yeah.
I can decisively answer these questions with
That's
no
right.
hesitation.
It's all so clear to me.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was.
I mean, yeah, if we look back, all of us, if we look back to who we were when we were in
Yes.
our 20s, just think
Yes.
about, who we were. We could I was ready to conquer the world. I go to New York and I say, New York, here I am, I'm ready to. I mean,
Yes.
the kind of confidence we had in whatever we thought about, it's amazing how we've changed.
Yeah.
But I do also, this thought also came to my mind, Rick, as I'm sitting here listening to you all. Rick, you would have made a great king. Just wanted to let you know that.
Yes, I agree.
I really think
I agree.
your wisdom at such a young age, I mean, I really think that you would have made a very wise, wonderful king.
But he worked
Right,
hard to
Joe?
get
Joe,
that
you're with
wisdom.
me on that, right, Joe?
I'm with
Yeah.
you. I'm
Yeah,
with you.
Rick is brilliant. Absolutely.
I have to share
I'm
more
starting my
information.
nonprofit for him now.
Yeah,
This is
right.
Sentimentality.
Well,
I have way too much for you.
You could have been a king on the level of our King Arthur, Yeah.
I'm a deeply foolish person.
Well,
That's the most important part.
I want to say something that's kind of important to the revolution, because we make a big deal of Martin Luther King, and so we should.
Yes.
But SNCC was very, very important. And certainly Malcolm X was very important. If it wasn't for them, I wonder whether Martin Luther King would have been successful. So I think particularly SNCC was such a young group, that they just wanted to, push. And
Yeah.
so that was kind of important. Yeah. So
Can I just follow up on that one point? Because
Sure.
I'm studying world history, and one of the things I'm seeing is that our basic human nature allows for repetitive episodes as we try to progress.
Yeah.
The method in which we progress seems almost the same because it's driven by our basic human nature. So therefore, you're saying SNCC and Malcolm X, and now we have Black Lives Matter. It's that same kind of activism and anger that's drawing attention to what the society at the time perceives as social injustices.
no.
And again, it's driven by the young because they can't appreciate consequence as much as when your hair starts turning
Right.
gray.
Yeah, Pico didn't know what he was starting, but you can bet that people who came afterwards understood a whole lot more clearly what was being started because they saw the example.
Thank
They're
God
like,
for all
oh,
those.
is that what's at stake?
Thank God for all those foolish people.
Yeah, yeah. I know you got your hand up, Stephen, but I really have to wrap up because we're over the hour. So write it down. Don't forget
Thank
it. Bring
you
it back next
very
week.
much. I
Thank
like
you,
this.
Rick.
Thank you, Rick.
As
Thank you, Rick.
always.
And I apologize for being late.
Let him
All right.
wrap up. Let him wrap up.
Bye, Joe.
So the plan for next
Bye.
week, right? It's still Pico, but no longer focused on him. We're going to talk about Savonarola. We're going to talk about Avicenna. We're going to talk about Martin Luther. We're going to talk about all these threads that path. We're going to talk about the Medicis. So we're going to say, what was he at the center of?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just
The
him.
culture.
Yes. All these other people had a huge impact on what was happening and why people.
I just wanted to make a point.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
As minds, we live in bubbles. And I'm warning you guys, if you want to punch even insignificantly outside of that bubble you have, you're going to experience terror.
Yes,
It's not
That's
a
all
nice
right.
word. That's all right.
that's all right.
Yes.
You do
a
not
little
know
terror is
yourself.
always good.
Well, we're not in
um,
China, for heaven's sake. Come on.
Rather than Professor Marshall, I'm going to
On the other
say King
hand, Rick, they
Marshall.
don't understand the life I led. A little terror is always good.
The terror
Please,
is
before that.
truly terrifying. You do not understand.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah.
Bye, King
And-
Marshall.
Oh God, stop it, Ginny.
Bye-bye.
No. All right, I'll talk to you guys next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.